Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. There was a moment deep inside Desilu Stage 15 when Star Trek almost died before it even began. What they captured on film was so strange, NBC didn't know whether to cancel it or make television history.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
You know, whenever I sit down to talk about Star Trek's beginnings, I always come back to this strange, shimmering moment that feels half myth, half miracle. The creation of the cage. And every time I revisit it, I'm struck by just how close this whole universe came to vanishing before it ever had a chance to breathe. Because the cage wasn't just a pilot. It was an ordeal, a trial by fire. A production so ambitious, so chaotic, so defiantly unlike anything television had ever tried that the people behind it almost buckled under the weight of their own dreams. And yet, that's where Star Trek truly began. That's where its heart started beating. Right there in those echoing stages at Desilu Culver City, among pigeons, buzzing bees, broken toilets, and one exhausted team trying to create a future no one else could see. Tuition. Magic time, they called it. But nothing about this felt magical at first. The plan was simple on paper. Produce a pilot film so groundbreaking, NBC would have no choice but to pick up the series. Gene Roddenberry had delivered a script that read more like a feature film than an hour of television, and Herb Solow had convinced the network to gamble on a full 90-minute pilot. But the reality was something else entirely. Production designer Pato Guzman abruptly left for Chile. Matt Jeffries was designing a starship unlike anything the audience had ever seen, and it had to look real. The miniatures team built an 11-foot Enterprise so large the camera could barely move around it. The makeup department was wrestling with silicone ears that tore Leonard Nimoy's skin. And all of this was happening with a crew that had just finished The Lucy Show. A team accustomed to sitcom comfort suddenly tossed into deep space chaos. But the real battle didn't start until cameras rolled. The first day of shooting, pigeons in the rafters, bees in the walls, chaos everywhere. The cast gathered. The lights dimmed, the slate clapped, and then cooing. Pigeons. Living in the rafters above the alien planet set, a whole colony of them. Bob Justman, the assistant director and future Trek legend, looked up in horror as the sounds echoed in every direction. And when they cleared the pigeons out, that's when they discovered the bees. Not metaphorical bees, literal bees living inside the walls of the adjacent stage. That first week became a marathon of sound disasters. Pigeons cooing, bees buzzing, someone hammering next door, someone flushing a toilet during a take, someone using the women's restroom during another. Justman finally resorted to posting guards at the bathrooms, toilet monitors, as he called them, just to keep sound out of the tracks. And that's how the cage began. With pigeons, bees, and an assistant director sprinting between stages like he was trying to stop the apocalypse. The Enterprise sets didn't just have to look futuristic, they had to function under pressure. By the time Jeffries finished designing the Enterprise bridge, he'd created something television had never attempted. A unified 360-degree control environment meant to feel lived in. The consoles glowed. The screens pulsed. Every sightline mattered. And yet, all of that could fall apart if a certain alien illusion didn't work. Because the cage had a problem of scale. The Talosian chambers were supposed to feel cavernous, impossibly vast, but there wasn't enough money or stage space to build them. So Justman made a decision that feels almost magical now. He suggested using forced perspective. Build the set large in front, shrink it as it moves back, and at the far end, cast dwarves to play the Talosians in the distance. One of them had even appeared in The Wizard of Oz. The effect was stunning, eerie, dreamlike. The kind of thing audiences had never seen. And then they cut it. Not because it didn't work, but because the final edit simply didn't need the shot. It's one of those hidden gems of Trek lore, a brilliant effect lost to time, but born out of sheer desperation. And then there were the ears, Spock's ears, the bane of Leonard Nimoy's existence. Fred Phillips, the makeup wizard, created the first Spock ears from molds of Nimoy's actual ears. They were thin, delicate, painful. Every morning they were glued on with spirit gum. Every night they were peeled off with harsh solvents that burned Leonard's skin. And worse, the first prototype stuck straight out. As Justman put it,
he looked like a bus coming down the street with its doors open.
The solution? Wig tape. Double-sided industrial-strength wig tape pulling the ears tight against Nimoy's head. New day, new ears, new pain. But by the time the cameras rolled, those ears were iconic. Haunting even. Jeffrey Hunter, Susan Oliver, and the pilot cast that almost was. Jeffrey Hunter brought instant credibility to the production. His Captain Pike was thoughtful, brooding, restrained. A very different energy from the later Kirk dynamic. Susan Oliver, meanwhile, delivered one of the most unforgettable transformations in Trek history. Her portrayal of Vina, especially the greenskin delusion, was mesmerizing. You can almost sense the awe behind the scenes as they watched her dance under the lights, fully painted in shimmering emerald. And Nimoy? Quiet, uncertain, hesitant about becoming a
television freak,
as he put it. He worried the role would destroy his career. It's haunting to know that the three central figures of the cage would each drift away in different ways after the pilot's rejection. But let's talk about the moment that changed everything. The screening at NBC. Herb Solow and Roddenberry sat with the network executives in a darkened room, watching the culmination of months of exhausting work. When the lights rose, the verdict landed like a torpedo hit.
Too cerebral, too erotic, too unconventional.
Spock's ears were
demonic.
The green girl was.
Too sexual.
The story was.
Beautiful.
They said, but not.
Commercial.
It should have ended right there. Pilot rejected. Show dead. Everyone go home. But then something happened that no one expected. NBC was impressed. Not by the story, but by the scale. They had never seen a television pilot attempt something this ambitious. They had never seen world building on this level. They ordered a session pilot. The first one was too good, too strange, too big to ignore. In a way, the cage succeeded by failing. Its rejection proved Star Trek could be more than television. It could be an event. And yet, for a time, the cage was buried. Locked away as a failed experiment, dust settling on the prints, its cast dispersed, its sets torn down. But Herb Solow and Gene Roddenberry kept the flame alive. Behind the scenes, the pilot was becoming a legend, a whispered what if, the Star Trek that almost was. Jeffrey Hunter would move on. Susan Oliver would walk into Trek mythology, and Nimoy, the man hesitant about his legacy, would return. This time, not as a near-silent science officer, but as the emotional core of a brand new crew. It's as though the cage passed the torch forward, not through success, but through persistence. Looking back, it's clear. The making of the cage forged the soul of Star Trek. It set the tone for everything that came after. Bold ideas, stubborn optimism, inventive problem-solving, beauty born from chaos. A crew that kept going even when the future looked impossible. The cage is a testament to what Star Trek would always be. Not just stories about the future, but stories about people fighting to build that future. People who believed in something that didn't exist yet. People who looked past the noise, the pigeons, the bees, the budgets, and saw something vast and luminous beyond the horizon. Whenever I revisit those early accounts, I'm always struck by the same feeling. That this production shouldn't have worked at all. It was too hard, too strange, too ambitious, too expensive. And yet, somehow, improbably, beautifully, it laid the first stone on a path that fans would follow for generations. And maybe that's the true magic of it all. The knowledge that Star Trek didn't start with triumph. It started with doubt, with struggle, with rejection. And still, it endured. Still, it became legendary. Still, it found its audience. Because the people making it believed in the future they were trying to build. And in the end, that belief was enough. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. The studio was collapsing. The board was panicking. And then one person, the last person anyone expected, suddenly said yes. And that quiet decision changed the future of science fiction forever.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
There's a moment in the Star Trek origin story that I've always come back to. A moment that feels almost mythic now. Like something out of Trek lore rather than the messy, unpredictable world of 1960s Hollywood. And yet, according to Herb Solow and Bob Justman, it happened exactly this way. And it changed everything. I think about Lucille Ball. Yes, that Lucy. Sitting in a Desilu board meeting, listening politely as her executives explain what's happening with her studio. And then she suddenly interrupts Solow, asks him about a
South Seas series.
She swears he pitched and won't let it go. For a few strained seconds, even Herb himself doubts his own memory. Because when Lucille Ball was confident about something, you didn't push back lightly. But what she calls a South Seas series is Star Trek. Not a metaphor, not a joke. She genuinely thought the phrase Star Trek meant a USO tour of celebrities hopping between Pacific islands. That's how alien the concept was in 1964. Star Trek wasn't a cultural touchstone yet. It wasn't on lunchboxes, or in syndication, or stitched onto the jackets of astronauts. It was just an oddball pitch floating around the upper floors of a studio held together by Lucy's charisma and borrowed money. But that misunderstanding, that tiny human moment, sits at the crossroads of television history. Because once Solow explained it, Lucy listened, and the future of Star Trek quietly turned a corner. It's the moment the fate of the franchise slipped into the hands of someone who believed in talent, not in genres. And I love that. Desilu on the brink. To understand why that moment mattered, we first have to see Desilu as it really was. Not the legend, not the empire, but the studio Lucy fought desperately to keep alive after her divorce from Desi Arnaz. By the time Herb Solow arrived, Desilu had, well, let's be honest, one functioning show, The Lucy Show. That was it. One hit propping up the whole operation. And everyone knew how fragile that was. CBS, which relied on Desilu for production space, saw the studio teetering. Ashley Famous, the agency with its hooks deep in Hollywood, saw a business opportunity. Both wanted stability. And so they brought in Oscar Katz, a respected CBS executive, to run the studio. Except Katz didn't actually know how to run a studio, and he knew it. By his own private admission, he was drowning. So he called Herb Solow. Herb walks into a Desilu that feels half asleep. A studio with 3 scattered lots, no real momentum, and no sense of direction. He and Katz divide responsibilities. Oscar handles important matters. Herb handles everything that actually keeps a studio alive. Development, pilots, talent, the future. That's the part that always hits me. Herb wasn't handed a vibrant operation. He was handed the keys to a shop barely keeping the lights on, and he had to find something, anything, that could justify Desilu's continued existence. Imagine being in that position, sitting in a quiet office at a studio built on the back of sitcom laughter, and a tall, scruffy ex-police officer named Gene Roddenberry shuffles in, mumbling about a
wagon train to the stars
on a wrinkled piece of paper. That's the moment where science fiction's future meets television's past. The gamble no one else would make. It's easy to forget, now that Star Trek feels inevitable, just how weird it was at the pitch stage. The network saw sci-fi as cheap kids stuff. NBC worried about aliens. CBS didn't want it. Even the people in the room weren't sure if audiences would accept a show set in a future that hadn't happened yet. So when Herb pushed NBC into ordering a 90-minute pilot, he wasn't just selling them a pitch. He was staking the future of Desilu on something that looked like a gamble to everyone except him and Gene. NBC took the chance, cautiously, nervously, and Desilu went to work. But remember, Desilu had no sci-fi production team. They had no effects department, no designers who knew how to build a starship bridge, no technicians ready to create aliens. Their one crew was built for sitcoms. But they tried anyway. And the budget buckled almost immediately. Stages had pigeons. The walls had bees. Pipes rattled. Toilets flushed mid-take. This wasn't a sleek Hollywood machine. It was a studio held together with tape, coffee, and hope. And still, somehow, they've pushed the work forward. Lucy steps in. While Solow juggled network politics and Roddenberry reshaped the show daily, something else was happening at the executive level. Lucille Ball, the woman who made the studio possible, mostly stayed quiet during board meetings. She listened. She trusted her people. She didn't meddle. But when it mattered, she spoke. And what she said changed history. When the Cage came back from NBC with a note too cerebral, that might have been the end for any other studio. No money, no additional pilot, no chance to keep going. But NBC didn't cancel the idea. They did something rarely done. They ordered another pilot. Now the question was whether Desilu could shoulder the cost. And that's when Herb went to Lucy. He told her the truth. This was their shot. If they didn't take it, the studio had nothing new to sell and no future to build. Lucy listened to him. She let him make his case, calmly, patiently, her executives watching with dread. And when it came down to the decision, she said yes. She greenlit the second pilot. No fans had written letters yet. There was no cult following. There were no conventions. There wasn't even a cast everyone agreed on. There was only Lucille Ball, the biggest star in television, betting her entire company on one show. When people ask who saved Star Trek, there are dozens of answers. But in this moment, it was Lucy. The ripple effect begins. Lucy's yes did more than authorize another pilot. It set off a chain reaction through the industry. It let Herb and Gene rebuild the cast from scratch. It allowed Matt Jeffries to redesign the Enterprise. It gave Roddenberry space to refine the philosophy. It turned Spock from a network liability into an anchor of the franchise. And it brought in Bill Shatner, the captain who defined Star Trek's heartbeat. Every part of the Trek mythos, the bridge, the uniforms, the captain's log, the transporter, exists because Lucy let the work continue. And here's something that always moves me. She didn't understand science fiction. She wasn't a fan. She didn't see the future the way Roddenberry did. She simply believed in her people, and that faith kept everything alive long enough for the rest of the world to catch up. There's an irony in the story that feels almost poetic, and Herb points it out late in their book. When Gulf and Western bought Desilu and merged it into Paramount, the crown jewel of the entire deal wasn't the Lucy show. It wasn't Desilu Stages. It wasn't the lots. It was Star Trek. A show that barely survived its first breath became one of the most valuable media properties in history. Paramount didn't realize it yet. But Herb did. He knew the biggest gamble Lucy ever took, a gamble made without hype, without knowing the genre, without seeing the future, was going to define the studio long after she was gone. What I love most about this story, what I carry with me every time I think about Trek's origins, is how quietly the miracle happens. There's no thunderclap, no triumphant music sting, no heroic pose. Just a Dayu Oman who built a studio on dreams, and a producer who believed in a story, and a wrinkled sheet of paper from a guy who didn't know how to comb his hair. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. What do you do when a pilot fails? But the network can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes the most unlikely second chances forge the most legendary futures.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
I've always been fascinated by the moment that Star Trek, this fragile, untested idea, held together with papier-mâché cliffs and script pages still warm from the typewriter, somehow convinced NBC to do the impossible. When the network executives gathered around a screening room in early 1965, they weren't expecting to change television history. They were expecting to stamp rejected on yet another expensive, overreaching science fiction pilot. And yet, they couldn't. There's something almost emotional about that turning point. You can feel the tension rising, the frustration, the disbelief, and then the strange, dawning curiosity that kept pulling their attention back toward the cage. The pilot wasn't what they wanted. It was too slow, too thoughtful, too psychological, too cerebral, as the phrase eventually entered Star Trek folklore. But even in their disappointment, they kept circling back to the same problem. There was nothing else like it on television. When I picture that screening room, I imagine the executives giving each other those sideways glances, the kind that say,
"This isn't right. But it's not wrong either."
Behind them, Roddenberry sat quietly, hopeful, but bracing. He knew he hadn't given them the network-style action they expected. Instead, he'd given them a meditation on captivity and illusion, a story about the loneliness of command. It was a risk, and NBC wasn't sure what to do with it. But not sure is a very different thing from no. What the transcript reveals, which you can really feel between the lines, is how tantalizing the cage was to them. They rewound scenes. They tested conversations. They debated Spock, debated the woman in command, debated the tone, debated the intellectualism. They debated everything except one thing, the ambition. NBC had never seen a science fiction pilot fight so hard to be taken seriously, and that's what did it. That's what kept the room from moving on. Roddenberry hadn't just built a show. He'd built a world. Every corridor, every console, every alien gesture, it all felt unified somehow, deliberate, and that kind of cohesion was rare. Even the executives who disliked the pilot couldn't shake the idea that someone had poured their entire soul into it. So how do you reject something that stays with you? That's the paradox that led NBC into completely uncharted territory. They didn't want the cage, but they wanted Star Trek. Those two sentences rarely coexist in television. What makes this so extraordinary is that pilots in the 1960s weren't cheap experiments. They were expensive gambles, funded by studios who already knew the odds were terrible. Those same executives had just spent nearly $500,000 on the cage, an astronomical sum for its time. The show had used forced perspective sets, rotating lighting grids, rear projection, complicated prosthetics, and an approach to narrative that belonged more to literary science fiction than TV. This wasn't something you tossed away lightly. And yet NBC was prepared to do exactly that, until a dozen small details kept nagging at them. Spock's intensity, the eerie power of the Talosians, the stark beauty of Vina shimmering under unforgiving lighting, the opening scene of the Enterprise grandly sweeping into view. Scenes that felt theatrical, in a way television rarely attempted. NBC's research department came back with surprising results too. Not great, but intriguing. Viewers were confused by Number One's authority, puzzled by Spock's appearance, and unsure of what kind of series it was supposed to be. But they also reacted to the quality. The scale. The feeling of a big idea that wasn't going to let go. And that was enough to push the decision into a sort of purgatory. Canceling it felt premature. Moving forward felt risky. The endless meetings, the pushing, the pulling, the second-guessing. Everyone had an opinion. No one wanted to be wrong. And then came the moment. The moment when someone at NBC, in what must have felt like an almost absurd leap of faith, said, "Why not ask for another one? A second pilot." Now, second pilots had been done before, but this was a second pilot request like no other. No one had done that before. Not at that budget, not at that scale, not at that creative distance from the first. But here's the beautiful, almost poetic truth. NBC didn't want to fix the cage. They wanted to find the version of Star Trek that lived inside it. The one that felt energetic, adventurous, accessible. A series with action instead of metaphysics, with character chemistry instead of introspection. So they gave Roddenberry a rare gift, a second chance, but with strings. Big strings. Number One had to go. She confused audiences and made the network uncomfortable about the woman in command. Spock could stay, but softened. More human. Less demonic. The pacing had to quicken. The philosophy needed weight, but not dominance. They wanted a captain with more charm, more swagger, more immediacy. Roddenberry knew what they were asking. They wanted a star. They wanted William Shatner before William Shatner was ever hired. But there was something else, too. Something deeper than the usual network notes. NBC wasn't trying to save Roddenberry's ego or Desilu's finances. They were trying to save a show that had potential. Potential strong enough to justify paying for the same mistake twice, just in case the second try wasn't a mistake at all. That's the part I love. Because we often tell this story as if Roddenberry fought the world and triumphed, but in truth, NBC took a risk that no other network would have taken. They were the ones who said, "Something's here. Don't throw it away yet." Herb Solow in Bob Justman's book Inside Star Trek gives us a rare window into the way they debated the second pilot's tone. Lighter, punchier, faster. Something that moved with the pulse of 1960s television. And when the new script emerged titled Where No Man Has Gone Before, it wasn't a rejection of the cage. It was its reflection. The same ambitions, reshaped for a new audience. It kept the Enterprise, kept the optimism, kept the strange, alluring precision of the universe Roddenberry imagined. But this time it added energy, conflict, and a human tragedy at the center of the drama. NBC watched it. They paused. And this time, they said yes. The second pilot wasn't just an approval. It was a validation. Proof that the first stumble had been worth it, because it revealed the path forward. And when NBC ordered a full season, they weren't just investing in a show. They were investing in the very idea that a series could think bigger, dream louder, and reach farther than anything else on television. Sometimes I imagine a version of the world where NBC didn't hesitate, where they rejected the cage outright and moved on to the next pilot in the stack. Star Trek fades into a footnote. Roddenberry writes something else. A generation grows up without Spock, without the Prime Directive, without the Enterprise as an idea of who we could be. But that's not the world we got. We got the one where hesitation turned into curiosity, and curiosity turned into history. And that, more than anything, is why the unprecedented second pilot still feels like a miracle. Not because Roddenberry demanded it, but because NBC, of all places, recognized that something special was worth one more try. And thank the stars they did. It's the most beloved episode of the classic show. But behind the scenes, the Tribbles nearly died before they ever squeaked.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. When I walk through the book, there's a particular section that always pulls a smile out of me, the story of the Tribbles. Not the episode, not the fandom, not even the furry avalanche we all know from the screen. No. It's the creation of Tribbles. The almost accidental birth of one of the most iconic moments in Star Trek's entire history. And what strikes me most is how close it all came to never happening at all. The book doesn't frame it like a triumphant production win. Instead, it shows us a creative moment teetering on the edge. A script that was nearly too cute, too whimsical, too light. And in the middle of a show still trying to find its identity, that was dangerous ground. It starts with something simple. A young writer with a playful idea. David Gerrold, new, hungry, hopeful. Walking into Star Trek with a script that he thought would be fun, charming, a little bit irreverent, and extremely risky. The book captures the reaction beautifully. The moment the first draft hit the production office, you can almost hear the hesitation, the raised eyebrows, the quiet murmurs. Star Trek was wrestling with identity. It was juggling philosophy, drama, budgets, ego, tension. And here came a story about fuzzy creatures that reproduced uncontrollably. The concept raised smiles, but it also raised concerns. The book shows that the initial response wasn't outright rejection. It was uncertainty. Was this too comedic? Too whimsical? Would it pull the tone away from the moral seriousness Roddenberry envisioned? This was not a time for risk. The show was fighting for survival. NBC was scrutinizing every creative decision. And suddenly on someone's desk sat a script full of adorable chaos. But here's where the book becomes fascinating. Instead of dismissing it, the production office debated it. They argued, they circled it. And in those circles, the episode began finding its place. The turning point wasn't Roddenberry. It wasn't the writer's room. It wasn't the network. It was Gene Coon. And the book highlights this with quiet reverence. Coon had a gift, a sense for balance. He understood when an episode needed tension, when it needed heart, when it needed philosophy, and when it needed a breath of levity. He knew Star Trek couldn't survive on moral weight alone. It needed charm, humor, humanity, something to make the audience exhale. Coon recognized value in the Tribbles from the moment he read them. But he also knew the script wasn't ready. The book shows his fingerprints everywhere, not rewriting to erase Gerald's voice, but tightening, sharpening, polishing. He didn't take ownership. He lent steadiness. He turned a funny idea into a Star Trek story. The internal discussions were intense. How many Tribbles? How quickly do they multiply? How does the crew react without turning the show into pure comedy? What is the science? Does it matter? How do you stage something that is simultaneously absurd and grounded? These weren't trivial questions. They were existential. Star Trek had never done an episode like this. And the book makes it clear the team was divided. Some embraced the humor, some feared it, some worried NBC would hate it. Some worried fans would see it as jumping the shark. And then, even before that phrase existed. But something magical happened during these debates. The script didn't weaken. It strengthened. The Tribbles began winning people over. Slowly. Quietly. Idea by idea. Draft by draft. The book notes how staff members, exhausted from the grind of production, began smiling during table reads. How actors chuckled reading the pages. How the weight of the show's usual crises, budgets, rewrites of rewrites, seemed lighter in the presence of these ridiculous little creatures. But even then, the episode wasn't safe. The biggest hurdle wasn't writing. It was production. How do you physically create Tribbles? What do they look like? What texture? What size? How many does the set need? Can we afford them? Remember, this was a show scraping pennies from the floors of its own budget wells. Nothing was easy. Nothing was cheap. The book reflects the tension around the practicalities. People worried the mock-ups would look silly in the wrong way, cheap rather than charming. There were debates about color, movement, whether they needed mechanical parts, whether they should vibrate or squeak, or simply sit like props. The worry wasn't unfounded. If the Tribbles looked off, the entire episode would collapse. So testing began. Early prototypes were promising, fuzzy, round, and weirdly adorable. But concerns remained. Would they photograph well? Would they look too static? Would the joke land? Would the humor translate? And then something unexpected happened. The more the cast interacted with the prototypes, the more everything clicked. The actors believed in the Tribbles. Shatner especially saw the comedic potential. Nimoy saw the contrast they created with Spock's logic. The rest of the cast recognized that this was an episode where character reactions would define the humor, not the props themselves. That realization shifted everything. Suddenly the Tribbles didn't have to move, or blink, or open tiny mouths, or squeak with mechanical precision. They just had to be there, soft, multiplying, and increasingly intrusive. The characters would carry the comedy. The episode would carry the charm. The book reveals one final obstacle, and it's almost poetic. Roddenberry, who had approved the episode, still had reservations. He feared the series tilting too far into comedy. He worried that the writers or network might see this as permission to loosen the tone. Coon reassured him. This wasn't abandoning philosophy. It was giving the audience and the cast a breath. Star Trek needed air, needed laughter, needed a moment that let humanity shine through the tension and ethics and cosmic stakes. So production moved forward. Sets were dressed, props were built, Tribbles were stuffed, barrels were filled. And when filming began, the book offers something beautiful. The crew laughed. The actors laughed. The director laughed. Even the producers laughed. It wasn't silliness. It was joy. A rare thing in the brutal grind of weekly production. Scenes that could have derailed the show instead became iconic. Kirk buried by Tribbles, Scotty drowning in them, Spock raising an eyebrow as one trembles in his hand. Each moment worked because everyone involved had stopped treating Tribbles like a risk and started treating them like a gift. And by the time filming ended, the mood had shifted. The episode was no longer a gamble. It was a triumph. The book doesn't offer fanfare. It doesn't indulge in nostalgia. It simply reflects an understanding, almost quiet, almost emotional, that these silly little creatures had done something profound. They gave Star Trek permission to breathe, to laugh, to be human, and the irony is perfect. The episode that almost didn't make it became one of the most beloved Star Trek stories ever told. And to this day, when I rewatch it, I feel that same warmth the book radiates. The sense that behind the scenes, in a studio fighting for its life, something soft and ridiculous and utterly joyful managed to sneak in and remind everyone why they were making this show in the first place. Sometimes the smallest stories carry the biggest heart. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. You know, there's a moment in Star Trek's history when the future almost didn't get built. A blank page, a panicked studio, and one designer told to invent a starship from nothing. And somehow, he did.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
I still smile when I think about the moment the ship took shape. Not the fictional Enterprise that lived in Gene's head, but the physical one. The one that had to exist as lumber and paint and camera angles and the sweat of a crew trying to conjure the future out of nothing at all. You know, when I go back through the early memories of how Star Trek became real, I always find myself returning to this simple truth. Nobody, not Gene, not Herb Solow, not Bob Justman, really understood how hard it was going to be to build a universe. Not imagine it, not pitch it, but build it. And for a little studio like Desilu in the mid-1960s, building the future wasn't a metaphor. It meant finding an art director who could do the impossible. It meant creating shapes no one had ever seen before. Shapes that still had to be practical enough to shoot with cameras that weighed more than the actors. It meant facing the truth that there was no blueprint for this, no earlier show to imitate, no guide. Just a handful of people staring at the blank wall of possibility. And that's exactly where this story begins. The funny thing is, Gene Roddenberry could imagine a starship, but he couldn't visualize one. Not really. He knew what it shouldn't look like. No Flash Gordon fins, no Buck Rogers thrusters, nothing that smelled of pulp futurism. But as for what it should look like, that was a mystery even to him. I love that honesty. It reminds us how fragile invention really is. Even the man credited with creating Star Trek was, in those early moments, still fumbling through old sci-fi magazines, pointing at illustrations that were nearly 30 years old. He was chasing inspiration, not direction, and he was exhausted. Then Herb Solow brought in a name that would quietly define Star Trek forever. A man who didn't brag, didn't preen, didn't write manifestos about the future. He just drew. His name was Walter Matt Jeffries. And everything, absolutely everything, changed the moment he sat down at his drafting table. Imagine being that guy. You're handed a scribbled concept, something like,
Wagon train to the stars.
You're told the ship.
Shouldn't look silly. Shouldn't look like a rocket. Should suggest a new kind of power we don't yet understand.
And you have to turn that into a real shootable object that will convince millions of people that humanity will one day cross the galaxy. No pressure at all. And Matt, he didn't just sketch pretty pictures. He invented a visual logic for the ship, a justification for every line, every curve, every negative space. Piece by piece, he built physics into the design, what we now all call Jeffries tubes, warp nacelles, and the iconic saucer and pylon's silhouette. Even Gene had to step back and say,
Yes, this is the Enterprise.
It took trip after trip into Gene's office, sketches revised again and again, until the form finally stabilized into the impossible. A starship that looked both futuristic and functional. A starship that belonged to us. A starship that felt real. This is the part I always linger on. The moment where imagination crashes into lumber, paint, budgets, and physics. Because Desilu didn't have a team ready for this. They had the Lucy show crew, and as Herb Solow admitted, they were fantastic professionals, just not trained to create a science fiction universe. So when the design was finally approved, those drawings went to Darrell Anderson and the miniature crew at the Howard Anderson Company. And what they built wasn't miniature at all. It was 11 feet long. A starship so big that the camera had to move instead of the model. By today's standards, that's absurd, but in 1964, it was insanity. And it worked. But the size created a strange problem. The model consumed so much space on the miniature stage that the camera couldn't move freely. Shots had to be choreographed like ballet, weaving light and motion through a forest of rigging, cables, rails, and carefully spaced supports. Every frame of the Enterprise gliding through space was a triumph, not of computers, not of industrial machinery, but of human hands guiding a camera across a few feet of stage with absolute precision. If the Enterprise model was the body of the show, the bridge was the heart. And Matt Jeffries knew that. Every blinking panel, every sculpted console, every geometric shape had to communicate one powerful idea. This is what the future feels like. And it had to do so without looking campy, or cheap, or borrowed from another 1950s serial. Jeffries worked closely with a German-born art director named Franz Borchlin, who stepped in after the original art director, Pato Guzman, suddenly left the production. Together, Jeffries and Borchlin crafted the ship's bridge, a circular command center with sightlines no other TV show had dared to build. The screens, the chairs, the stations, and the colors. It wasn't futuristic for the sake of novelty. It was futuristic because it felt useful. You were supposed to believe people lived and worked here, that the blinking lights weren't flashing nonsense, but data streaming through a starship's veins. And that's precisely how it played. This part of the story is one I never get tired of exploring because it reveals just how much Trek cheated, brilliantly, creatively, joyfully cheated, to stay on budget and still sell the illusion of vastness. To film alien worlds, Jeffries built forced perspective mini mountains, movable rocks, and mounded sand landscapes on stage 16. He created a seamless planet horizon by wrapping the entire set with a neutral white sky backing and lighting it with gel-filtered lamps to tint the sky any color the story needed. Want a green sky? Purple? Hard orange twilight? Just swap gels. No repainting. No rebuilding. Painting with light. That's what they called it. It was ingenious, cheap, flexible, and shot beautifully. And then there were the sets inside the Enterprise. Because Desilu was cramped for stage space, everything had to be modular. Kirk's cabin became Spock's cabin. The briefing room became a recreation room. Engineering became the shuttle bay. Walls slid, swapped, folded, or vanished. Furniture rotated in and out like starship origami. Even the now famous Jeffries tube was a budgetary miracle, a vertical cylinder built on wheels, lit from within, filled with little blinking thingamajigs, and rolled onto the stage whenever Scotty needed to save the galaxy. Every trick solved a problem. Every problem made Trek smarter. While Jeffries built the visuals, another team breathed life into the ship through sound. The transporter effect, just aluminum powder dropped in front of a slow-motion camera. The warp flyby whoosh! Composer Sandy Courage making sounds with his own mouth into a microphone. And the sound of the Enterprise itself, the hum of its corridors, the pulse of its consoles, was crafted by sound editors Joe Sorokin and Doug Grindstaff, who spent hours layering machine noise, beeps, and even background crew chatter into atmospheric loops for each part of the ship. It's one of my favorite Trek truths. The Enterprise didn't just look real. It sounded real. That hum became part of our imagination. By the time the cameras rolled on the Corbomite maneuver, the Enterprise was no longer just a model or a set. It was a character, an idea you could touch, inhabit, and believe in. And that's why this story still resonates with me. Because what those early artists did, they didn't just create a starship, they created a future that felt welcoming. A place where humanity matured instead of collapsed. A space where our better selves survived. Standing there on those early stages, surrounded by painted foam, blinking lights, and a 14-foot miniature no one could afford, they somehow constructed something that felt more permanent than the set around them. They built a ship that could carry us, not through space, but through time. Through decades, through generations of fans who still look at that shape and feel something familiar, something hopeful. And that's why the Enterprise endures. Not because of the plywood, not because of the nacelles, not because of the lights, but because a handful of people at Desilu, Herb, Gene, Bob, Matt, Franz, Derol, the electricians, the carpenters, the painters, all believed they were building something that meant something. And they were right. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. What if one script was so explosive, so unfilmable, so fiercely defended that it nearly tore Star Trek apart from the inside, before becoming its most haunting masterpiece?
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. There's a kind of electricity that crackles through the book whenever Harlan Ellison's name appears. The kind you feel when two storms collide. You sense it immediately. The tension, the admiration, the exhaustion, and the bruises left behind. Ellison wasn't just a writer. He was a force. A Category 5 creative hurricane who rarely walked into a room so much as detonate inside it. And yet, for all the friction, Star Trek desperately wanted and needed voices like his. But the price was high. For everyone. What the book reveals is far more nuanced than folklore. We often reduce the story to a simple narrative. Ellison wrote City on the Edge of Forever, Roddenberry rewrote it, Ellison exploded. But the reality, preserved in the recollections and emotional fingerprints of the production team, is far more complex. A saga of ambition, clashing philosophies, impossible deadlines, and a writer who poured everything he had into a script that was never going to survive intact. The moment Ellison entered the picture, you can feel Justman and Roddenberry bracing themselves. Not because they didn't respect him, they deeply did, but because Ellison's reputation preceded him. He was brilliant, intense, argumentative, volcanic. And when he believed in something, he believed with his entire soul. Star Trek needed that fire. But television struggles to contain someone like that. Ellison turned in the first draft of City, and the reaction was immediate. Astonishment. The book captures this beautifully. People were moved, captivated. The writing was lyrical, tragic, devastating in places, but it was also unshootable. Expensive, structurally incompatible with an ongoing series, and filtered entirely through Ellison's worldview rather than the more optimistic moral framework Roddenberry demanded. That tension is the heart of the story. Roddenberry wasn't angry. He was overwhelmed. The script was magnificent, but impractical. Scenes that required sets they couldn't build. Crowds they couldn't hire. Moments the actors couldn't deliver without breaking the characters they had carefully established over months of production. Ellison was writing literature. Roddenberry was producing television, and the two collided like starships at warp. But the real conflict wasn't technical. It was philosophical. Ellison's humanity was flawed, raw, desperate. He believed drama came from brokenness, addiction, crime, moral compromise, characters falling apart under pressure, and in his script, that darkness felt honest and necessary. Roddenberry, on the other hand, insisted that the future humanity he imagined had transcended those weaknesses. His characters, especially his leads, couldn't be addicts, deserters, criminals, or failures. They had to embody what we were striving toward, not what we were trying to escape. So when Ellison's script opened with a drug-addicted crewman selling out the Enterprise, Roddenberry saw an existential threat to the entire series. The book makes that moment unmistakably clear. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a line in the sand. And that line carried an emotional charge that never went away. Ellison was furious that Roddenberry wouldn't allow the darkness. Roddenberry was furious that Ellison wouldn't accept the system he was writing within. The production staff, especially Justman, found themselves in the middle, admiring Ellison's talent while desperately trying to wrestle the script into something filmable. That wrestling match took months. Draft after draft came in. Changes were requested, some were accepted, many weren't. The book even captures the subtle shifts in tone among the staff. First excitement, then concern, then fatigue.
Ellison is rewriting the show again.
One staffer murmured.
Roddenberry is rewriting Ellison again.
Another sighed. It became a loop, a creative loop with razor edges. At one point, according to the book's emotional rhythm, meetings with Ellison became so intense that Roddenberry began handling revisions indirectly. Scripts circulated with marginalia, notes softened, deadlines tightened, diplomacy grew thin. And Ellison reached a breaking point. Because to Ellison, rewriting wasn't collaboration, it was vandalism. He had delivered a story with jagged poetry, grief, sacrifice, a moral paradox so elegant it barely felt like television. But to Roddenberry, the paradox asked Starfleet officers to behave in ways he could not allow. Ellison's characters wandered into moral territory that broke the ethos of the series. So Roddenberry rewrote, and rewrote, and rewrote. The book reveals that other writers were pulled in as well to soften blows, tighten scenes, make dialogue feel like the established characters. In some corners, this felt like triage. In others, betrayal. Ellison saw the rewrites not as improvements, but as ideological interference, tampering, detuning the music he was trying to orchestrate. And as the weeks dragged on, his temper, always volcanic to begin with, ignited. He confronted Roddenberry. Roddenberry confronted him. Both men believed they were right. Both believed the show depended on preserving their vision. That's the tragedy of the story. They were both right. Ellison's script would have been a breathtaking science fiction film. Roddenberry's version would become one of the greatest hours of television ever made. And in that contradiction, you find the emotional heartache preserved inside the book, the sorrow, the pride, the disappointment. Ellison was devastated. Roddenberry was tired. The staff was burned out. But then, something astonishing happened. The episode aired, and it was magnificent. Different from Ellison's draft, but elevated by it, shaped by it, haunted by it. The book captures the sense of awe that spread across Desilu. Even those exhausted by the conflict admitted that Ellison's fingerprints remained everywhere. In the bones of the story, in the emotional gravity, in the tragic rhythm of Edith Keeler's fate. But Ellison didn't feel awe. He felt wounded. He felt erased. And over time, years, decades, the wound calcified. He spoke at conventions, wrote essays, gave interviews, and every time he returned to the same theme. His script had been butchered, ruined, damaged by people who didn't understand it. The book, however, shows that the staff did understand. They simply couldn't produce what he delivered. Television demanded compromise. Ellison demanded purity. And those two ideals were destined to collide. Was he right to be angry? Yes. From his perspective, utterly. Was Roddenberry right to protect the show's vision? Absolutely. That dual truth is what makes this story resonate so deeply. Ellison never forgave them. Roddenberry never apologized. And the production team never forgot the emotional cost. What remains now is something bittersweet. A sense of awe at the beauty Ellison created, and a sense of admiration for the version that finally reached the screen. Two masterpieces, one possible, one impossible, forever linked by collision. Great art isn't always born from harmony. Sometimes it comes from fire, sometimes from heartbreak, sometimes from two men who both believed they were saving the story. And when you watch City on the Edge of Forever today, you can still feel both voices whispering through it. Ellison's poetry, Roddenberry's philosophy, and the tension that shaped them both. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. She wasn't pushed out of Star Trek because she failed. She was pushed out because she was too powerful, too visible, and too close to the man in charge. This is the untold story.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. And according to Inside Star Trek, neither can be understood without the other. On the surface, her story appears to be about characters. Number one, then Nurse Chapel, and the network resistance those characters encountered. But beneath that surface was a second, equally powerful narrative. Majel Barrett was having an affair with Gene Roddenberry throughout this period, and that relationship profoundly shaped how NBC perceived her, judged her, and ultimately constrained her place in the series. Inside Star Trek makes this clear in a way later retellings often soften. Majel was not simply an actress whose role didn't survive the first pilot. She became a lightning rod, creatively, politically, and personally, at the exact moment Star Trek was struggling to justify its own existence. And that made everything harder. In the Cage, Majel's character, known only as Number One, represented a radical departure from television norms. She was the Enterprise's executive officer, calm, logical, unflinching. She didn't soften orders, she didn't defer emotionally. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Captain Pike as an intellectual equal. Herb Solow and Bob Justman are explicit. NBC's objections were not about her acting ability. Quite the opposite. She was convincing. She was authoritative. And that authority unsettled the network. Executives struggled to articulate their discomfort. The language they used, cold, too cerebral, lacking warmth, was vague by design. What they were reacting to, as Inside Star Trek documents, was the visual and thematic shock of a woman exercising command authority in a genre that already made executives nervous. Science fiction was expensive, it was untested, and now It was challenging gender expectations on top of that. NBC didn't see number one as progressive. They saw her as risky. Running parallel to these creative concerns was a far more volatile issue. Majel was in a very public affair with Gene Roddenberry, who was married at the time. Inside Star Trek does not treat this as gossip. It treats it as a production reality with consequences. NBC executives were fully aware of the relationship, and in their eyes, it complicated everything. Majel's casting as number one was no longer judged purely on creative grounds. It became suspect. To the network, the relationship created the appearance of favoritism, whether justified or not. Solow and Justman describe how this perception hardened resistance. Even those executives who might have been willing to tolerate a female executive officer were far less willing to tolerate one played by the producer's mistress. The issue then wasn't simply that Majel was a woman in command. It was that she was Gene Roddenberry's mistress in command. And that distinction mattered enormously in the corporate culture of the 1960s television. When NBC ordered a second pilot, an almost unheard of concession, they attached conditions. One of them was non-negotiable. Number one had to go. Inside Star Trek is unambiguous on this point. The network did not want Majel Barrett in a commanding role, and privately, they were increasingly uncomfortable with her presence on the show at all. This is where the two threads of her story collide. Creatively, number one represented a future NBC wasn't ready to show. Politically, Majel represented a problem NBC wanted neutralized. Roddenberry argued. He attempted to reframe. He proposed alternatives. But the network had made its calculation. If Star Trek was going to survive, concessions had to be made, and Majel was one of them. The character was eliminated, and with it, for a time, it appeared Majel herself would be eliminated from the series. Solow and Justman are careful, but clear. This was not merely a creative disappointment for Majel. It was personal. She had performed exactly as asked. She had delivered a restrained, disciplined performance that fit Roddenberry's vision precisely. And yet, she became the focal point of network anxiety, not because she failed, but because she represented too much change at once. At the same time, her relationship with Roddenberry placed her in an impossible position. She could not openly defend herself without reinforcing the very accusations NBC feared. Silence became the only viable option. This silence, inside Star Trek suggests, came at an emotional cost. Roddenberry did not abandon Majel, but bringing her back required compromise. Nurse Christine Chapel was created not as an afterthought, but as a strategic solution. If Majel could not be seen as a command figure, she might still be accepted in a caregiving role, one that aligned more comfortably with network expectations of femininity. Even then, resistance remained. Solow and Justman describe how NBC insisted on further distancing. Visual changes were required. The blonde wig was not cosmetic whimsy. It was camouflage. A deliberate attempt to make Majel less immediately recognizable and less symbolically threatening. The message was implicit but unmistakable. She could stay, but only if she changed. As Nurse Chapel, Majel Barrett delivered something NBC hadn't anticipated. The character became emotionally central to the series. Her unrequited love for Spock introduced vulnerability into a show otherwise dominated by stoicism and command logic. Chapel did not issue orders, but she mattered. Inside Star Trek notes how audiences responded to this emotional dimension. Through Chapel, viewers gained insight into Spock's internal struggle. Her presence softened the show without weakening it. And yet, the irony remained painful. Majel was accepted only when her authority was removed. Throughout this period, her illicit affair with Roddenberry continued, and continued to color how NBC viewed her. Solow and Justman make clear that the network never fully separated Majel from Gene Roddenberry in their thinking. Even as Chapel succeeded creatively, the personal relationship remained a source of quiet distrust. She was tolerated, not embraced, And this dynamic reinforced the limits placed on her career trajectory within the show. Behind the scenes, however, Majel became increasingly indispensable. She read scripts, offered feedback, provided emotional and creative support during a production period defined by uncertainty and pressure. Her contributions extended far beyond her screen time. This duality defines her Star Trek legacy as described in Inside Star Trek. On camera, she was constrained. Off camera, she was central. Majel's challenges on Star Trek cannot be reduced to a single cause. Inside Star Trek insists on this complexity. She faced resistance because number one challenged gender norms. She faced resistance because she was romantically involved with the show's creator, and those two facts reinforced each other in ways that made her position uniquely difficult. Remove either factor, and her story changes. Together, they made her unavoidable and vulnerable. Number one didn't fail because audiences rejected her. She failed because the system wasn't ready, and Majel paid the price for that unreadiness, professionally and personally. Nurse Chapel allowed her to remain part of Star Trek, but it came with conditions that reflected the era's limitations. Inside Star Trek does not portray Majel as bitter. It portrays her as resilient. She adapted. She stayed. She contributed quietly, even when recognition was uneven. Majel's early Star Trek journey is not simply a footnote about a recast role. It is a case study in how innovation collides with institutional fear and how personal relationships can magnify professional consequences. She carried the weight of two controversies at once. She survived both, and she remained a part of Star Trek's foundation long after others passed through. That endurance is her legacy, not just as number one, not just as Nurse Chapel, but as someone who stayed when leaving would have been easier and helped hold the franchise together at its most fragile moment. What if the person who saved Star Trek wasn't the one you've been told to remember?
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. When people talk about how Star Trek came together, the story usually sounds a lot more stable than it really was. A creator with a vision, a network willing to gamble, a cast that clicked, and a cultural phenomenon was born. But Inside Star Trek tells a very different story, one of constant instability, one missed deadline away from disaster, one unusable script away from a shutdown. The original series didn't glide into existence. It staggered, lurched, and nearly collapsed more times than most viewers ever realized. And that's where DC Fontana comes in. According to Inside Star Trek, Dorothy Catherine Fontana was never meant to be a headline name. She didn't enter the production as a star writer or a creative power player. She entered as Gene Roddenberry's secretary. That detail matters because it tells you exactly how Star Trek worked in its earliest days. Titles were formalities. Survival was the real job. And if you were capable, your responsibilities expanded whether anyone officially noticed or not. Fontana's desk put her in the center of the storm. She handled correspondence, read incoming story submissions, and assisted Roddenberry with story development. which meant she saw, firsthand, the single biggest problem Star Trek faced week after week: scripts that simply didn't work. Solow and Justman describe a production drowning in material that was late, unusable, wildly expensive, or completely misunderstood the show. Freelancers sent in science fiction stories that ignored character. Others delivered ideas that sounded interesting on paper, but collapsed under television budgets and schedules. Every bad script was a threat. Not creatively, logistically. If you didn't have a shootable teleplay, you didn't have an episode. And if you didn't have an episode, the show stopped. Fontana became one of the first lines of defense against that collapse. Inside Star Trek makes it clear that she wasn't just passing papers along. She was evaluating whether stories could survive contact with reality. She learned the difference between an idea that sounded like Star Trek and one that could actually be filmed as Star Trek. That understanding didn't come from theory. It came from proximity, from watching scripts fail, from seeing what NBC objected to, what Desilu couldn't afford, and what production schedules simply wouldn't allow. As the pressure increased, Fontana's role shifted again. Evaluation wasn't enough. Broken scripts couldn't always be thrown out. Deadlines were too tight. According to Solow and Justman, she moved into rewriting and repairing scripts that had to be made workable, fast. This wasn't about adding flair or personal style. It was about making dialogue playable, motivations clear, and scenes achievable on the sets and budgets available. This is one of the key things Inside Star Trek stresses over and over. Television doesn't reward perfection. It rewards completion. Fontana understood that. Her rewrites weren't designed to impress. They were designed to keep the cameras rolling. When her name finally appeared on scripts, it appeared as DC Fontana. The book confirms the credit, but it doesn't dramatize the reasoning behind it. What it does make clear is the environment she was working in. Science fiction television in the 1960s was overwhelmingly male, and women writers were rare enough to be exceptions rather than expectations. Solow and Justman don't assign a manifesto to the initials. They present them as part of the professional reality of the time. The credit existed. The work mattered. The rest was secondary. As Star Trek staggered forward, one of Fontana's most critical functions became maintaining character consistency. This was far more difficult than it sounds. Episodes were written out of order. Scripts came in from freelancers who barely knew the show. Rewrites happened constantly, sometimes days before shooting. Without someone tracking who these characters were supposed to be, they risked becoming wildly inconsistent from one episode to the next. Fontana understood how the characters worked together, particularly the central triangle of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Inside Star Trek credits her with preserving that balance through revision, not by imposing a grand philosophy, but by preventing drift, by making sure dialogue sounded like something those characters would actually say, by keeping emotional reactions within recognizable boundaries. That kind of work doesn't draw attention to itself. You only notice it when it's missing. Throughout the book, Gene Roddenberry is portrayed as the clear creative authority. Everything passed through him. Everything ultimately reflected his vision. Fontana worked entirely within that framework. Solow and Justman describe her as someone Roddenberry trusted to prepare material before it reached him, to anticipate problems, and to smooth out issues without creating conflict. There's no story here of rebellion or power struggles. There's a story of competence being quietly relied upon. And that competence became even more important as the series entered deeper trouble. Budgets shrank. Network pressure increased. Cancellation threats never really went away. Inside Star Trek paints a picture of a show that was always on the edge, always negotiating for one more chance. During this period, only a small group of people consistently held things together behind the scenes. Fontana was one of them. Her work expanded into emergency rewrites and script triage. When something broke, she helped fix it. When continuity threatened to unravel, she helped hold it together. These weren't celebrated moments. They were invisible ones. But Solow and Justman make clear how close the series often came to real trouble. One failed script could have shut everything down. One of the most honest elements of Inside Star Trek is how blunt it is about uncredited labor. Scripts were rewritten without bylines changing. Structural fixes disappeared into the production process. Recognition wasn't the priority. Survival was. Fontana's work often fell into that category. Essential, effective, and largely unseen. The book doesn't frame this as tragedy or injustice. It frames it as how television worked. People who kept shows alive didn't always get the spotlight. Fontana kept working anyway. Unlike many names associated with Star Trek, Fontana is not presented as a public-facing figure during the original run. She wasn't promoting the show or shaping its mythology after the fact. Her importance was internal. Solow and Justman consistently portray her as a professional who understood the mechanics of television and applied that understanding where it mattered most. By the time the original series ended, Inside Star Trek leaves no doubt about her value. Dorothy Catherine Fontana had become one of the most reliable creative figures inside the production, not because she dominated conversations, not because she claimed credit, but because she solved problems. She fixed what broke. She helped keep the show functioning when it was most fragile. Her legacy, as the book presents it, isn't about rewriting history. It's about understanding how history actually happened. Star Trek didn't survive because everything went right. It survived because people like D.C. Fontana made sure things went right often enough. In a production that lived under constant threat, that difference mattered. And that's the part of the story that often gets overlooked. Not the big speeches, not the bold ideas, but the quiet, relentless work that made it possible for those ideas to reach the screen at all. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. You ever hear the story of the day Star Trek nearly lost its most iconic character, all because of a pair of rubber ears?
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
I've always felt that Star Trek at its heart is a story about transformation, not just for its characters, but for the men and women who built that world in the first place. And every so often, when I go back through the early accounts of how it all began, I find these small, almost throwaway details that somehow end up shaping the entire franchise. And one of the most revealing and surprisingly emotional stories involves something as small, literal, and stubborn as a pair of rubber ears. When Herb Solow and Bob Justman talk about the beginning of Star Trek, they describe it as a kind of organized chaos, a whirlwind of meetings, misunderstandings, ambitions, and blind faith. And somewhere in the middle of all that whirlwind, Gene Roddenberry brought in this tall, quiet actor named Leonard Nimoy. Most of us know what that moment became, but at the time, it was nothing short of a gamble. Spock wasn't yet the Spock we'd all come to love. The calm center of the Enterprise, the moral compass, the man who taught a generation what it meant to live with logic and empathy intertwined. In those early days, he was simply the alien, an NBC. They hated that. They thought he looked
demonic.
They worried Bible Belt affiliates would refuse to carry the show. And they weren't wrong to worry. The pushback was immediate. But Gene believed in the character. Herb believed in the character. And Nimoy, well, Nimoy didn't believe in the ears. Not at first.
I don't want to be a television freak.
That wasn't the studio talking. That was Leonard. He worried that wearing prosthetics, especially such exaggerated ones, would trap him forever in roles that mocked or limited him. And honestly, who could blame him? This was 1964. Television was quick to typecast, and Gene was asking him to wear something that on paper sounded like a bad sci-fi parody. But once he agreed, those ears became his burden. Literally. The story Herb and Bob tell about Spock's ears is, in its own way, a tiny odyssey. Makeup artist Fred Phillips, already a veteran of complicated prosthetic work, took a cast of Leonard's ears and designed a pointed pair that could be glued on with spirit gum. Sounds simple. It wasn't. The glue hurt. The removal hurt even more. Every day, new ears. Every day, new pain. Once the ears came off, they couldn't be reused. The solvents were too strong. The material too delicate. It was daily ritual. Glue on, perform, glue off, recover. But even after the first pair was attached, another problem appeared, one they didn't expect.
He looks like a bus coming down the street with his doors open.
That line came straight from Fred Phillips. Because the first time they put the ears on Nimoy, they stuck out. Like, way out. Far enough that Spock suddenly looked less like an alien and more like a taxi with both doors open. Everyone realized instantly this wasn't going to work. So Fred came up with a fix, one that would last the entire series run. He used double-faced wig tape, pulling the ears back, tightening them against Nimoy's head until they lay flush with his skin. Hidden. Invisible. Perfect. It's such a tiny detail, but something about that improvisation tells you everything you need to know about the Star Trek crew. They weren't just building a television show. They were building a world, one strip of wig tape at a time. NBC's fear of Spock wasn't subtle. They were worried about advertisers, worried about affiliates, worried that a pointy-eared alien would drag the show into the wrong kind of controversy. When the first pilot was rejected, one of the reasons, maybe not the official one, but certainly one that whispered through the halls, was Spock. During the conversations leading up to the second pilot, NBC actually told Herb Solow that they thought the character himself was dangerous. They wanted him toned down, maybe even removed. And here's the thing, NBC didn't object to Leonard Nimoy. They liked the actor. They just feared the alien. Imagine television without Spock. Imagine the universe of Star Trek stripped of its conscience. It's almost unthinkable. Herb Solow didn't give in. Gene Roddenberry didn't give in either. Both of them refused to let Spock vanish. It wasn't just creative instinct, it was personal. Herb knew Spock anchored the future of the entire series, and Gene believed Spock gave Star Trek its soul. They were both right. The second pilot was ordered. The pointed ears stayed. The alien stayed. NBC held their breath. And then something remarkable happened. Instead of controversy, Spock became the breakout success of the entire show. It was the fans, the early ones, the ones who saw something beautiful in that calm, logical presence, who saved him. By the time Season 2 negotiations rolled around, he wasn't just safe, he was essential, irreplaceable. So irreplaceable, in fact, that when Nimoy began renegotiating his contract, the studio quietly panicked. They even began lining up potential replacements, Mark Lenard among them, just to prepare for the worst. But the truth is, everyone knew it. Only Nimoy could be Spock, and the ears stayed exactly where they belonged. One thing that always moves me about these behind-the-scenes stories is how incredibly human they are. Take Bob Justman, for example, the man who kept the entire production running. He recalls visiting the set, watching Leonard endure that grueling makeup ritual every day, and feeling both admiration and something like guilt. Because he knew Spock was the hardest role on the show, physically and emotionally. And yet Leonard brought a dignity to it that elevated the entire production. Those ears weren't just prosthetics. They were a promise, Leonard's promise, that he was giving everything he had. And when the cameras rolled, something magical happened. The ears became invisible. They weren't rubber anymore. They were Vulcan. It's easy to forget how radical Spock was in the mid-1960s. A half-human, half-Vulcan science officer. Logical, restrained, intellectual. A man defined by emotion, he never shows. But it was the visual design, the ears, that made him what he was. Without them, he's just another human, another officer, another crewman in a gold or blue tunic. But the ears made him alien, believable alien, without ever making him grotesque. It's astonishing how much of Spock's success rests on a quarter-inch of latex. When the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, went into production, the ears were still evolving. Gene and Herb knew that the first pilot's version had looked too sharp, too stylized, too much like the kind of alien makeup seen on anthology shows. So the redesign became another balancing act. More subtle, more refined, more Vulcan. And as Nimoy stepped deeper into the character, that measured cadence, that inward curiosity, that now famous eyebrow, the ears began to match him, not the other way around. It's a beautiful little symmetry when you think about it. Solow and Justman's book Inside Star Trek doesn't include later fan memories. But even within those early pages, you can sense it. Spock hit people immediately. During test screenings, he polarized the audience. But for viewers aged 16 to 35, the demographic NBC desperately wanted, he was magnetic. Fascinating. Even the network that once feared the ears suddenly depended on them. Spock became the face of the franchise, the symbol of what Star Trek dared to be. And that transformation all began with something Leonard Nimoy first resisted, and then embraced more deeply than anyone could have predicted. When I think about those painful morning rituals in the makeup chair, the wig tape, the solvents, the rejection fears, NBC's panic, and the daily fight to keep Spock in the show, I don't see rubber ears anymore. I see the birth of a character who helped define what Star Trek means. A character who taught us that being different is not a weakness, that logic and compassion can coexist, that identity is something you build, the way the Star Trek team built him, piece by piece. Spock didn't just wear the ears, he earned them. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. Imagine a single phone call, one that nearly erased Star Trek before it ever began. The captain was gone. The future was collapsing. And behind one closed office door, history teetered on the edge of disappearing forever.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. There's a strange, almost fateful stillness that hangs over the moment Jeffrey Hunter walked away from Star Trek. The Herb Solow and Bob Justman's book Inside Star Trek gives us this window, a vulnerable behind-the-scenes breath, when the future of the series felt as fragile as paper sets under hot lights. The first pilot had been rejected. A second one had been ordered shockingly. And now the man who embodied the solemn, introspective captain at the center of the cage was suddenly gone. It's the silence that gets me every time I read it. That quiet, stunned pause among the producers. That feeling of what now? Because losing the lead actor after one pilot wasn't just a setback, it was a crisis. You see, Hunter's contract called for him to play the role in the TV series had NBC approved the pilot, but they didn't. and he declined to sign a new one for another pilot. It threatened to unravel the fragile goodwill that had carried the project through NBC's first rejection. It jeopardized the unprecedented second chance the studio had been gifted, and it left Roddenberry and his team staring at the one role they couldn't afford to improvise. The Enterprise needed a captain, and that captain couldn't just be competent. He had to be magnetic, a personality big enough, warm enough, daring enough to carry the weight of a whole new universe on his shoulders. The Herb Solow and Bob Justman's book Inside Star Trek gives us a fascinating clue into how this played out. Jeffrey Hunter, already cautious about the grind of series television, was steered toward the exit by his wife. She didn't want him locked into a weekly job, didn't want him consumed by long hours for an uncertain reward. And as the pages recount, the exit was swift, firm, final. When the call came in, the reaction at Desilu wasn't anger. It was something closer to disbelief.
He's really not coming back?
You can feel the bewilderment settling across Roddenberry's office. Hunter had given the character a solemn gravity, a deep-set seriousness that matched the tone of the cage. And while NBC found that pilot too cerebral, the studio wasn't prepared to lose the man who represented its anchor. But here's the thing. Sometimes the cracks in the plan let the real light in, and that's what happened here. With Hunter gone, the team wasn't free-falling. They were free. Free to find a new energy, free to embrace a new rhythm, free to search for someone who could carry the momentum NBC clearly wanted. More action, more charisma, more immediacy. That's when William Shatner's name entered the room. And if you've ever seen early photos of Shatner before his Trek days, the ones where he's smiling with almost theatrical confidence, eyes lit with a kind of mischievous spark, you can practically feel why the producers perked up. He had presence. He had rhythm. He carried a built-in boldness that made everything feel just a little larger than life. The Herb Solow and Bob Justman's book Inside Star Trek hints at this perfectly. In the moment, Roddenberry and Justman screened some of Shatner's earlier work. The charm was undeniable. The ease with which he delivered lines felt instinctive. He had that intangible leading man energy that pulls you toward the screen without you realizing it. And more importantly, he looked like he enjoyed the adventure. That was the difference. Hunter had played the captain with a solemn, reflective intensity, the weight of command always pressing down. Shatner, on the other hand, seemed like the kind of captain who'd gladly lean into the unknown with a grin, a gamble, and a glint in his eye. And that shift, that spark, was exactly what NBC wanted for the second pilot. But even then, nothing was guaranteed. Casting a new lead meant re-anchoring the entire show's vision. The chemistry with Spock would shift. The style of command would change. The script would need to flex around a different kind of presence. And Shatner himself had to be convinced that Star Trek was worth stepping into. A science fiction show still reeling from one rejection and facing a second shot that might not stick. There's a wonderful moment in time that slips by almost casually. The creative team watching Shatner's performance and exchanging looks. Not the worried kind they'd given each other during earlier debates, but the knowing kind. The kind that says,
"This is it. This is our guy."
Not because he was perfect, but because he was alive on screen. That's the word that always comes to mind when describing Shatner. Alive. Energetic, curious, restless, ready. And when they reached out, Shatner didn't just accept the role, he embraced it. You can sense it in how the producers talk about those early days. He brought ideas. He brought energy. He brought a physicality and pace that shifted the show's entire gravitational balance. Suddenly the Enterprise wasn't captained by an introspective philosopher. It was captained by a confident explorer. The chemistry between Shatner and Nimoy, even before filming, carried a natural rhythm. An unspoken give and take that let each man shine without overshadowing the other. It's easy to forget how rare that is. How often great co-stars fail to mesh. But this pairing just worked. And almost immediately, the tone of Star Trek began to change. With Shatner on board, the second pilot script, Where No Man Has Gone Before, took on new life. Its pacing tightened. Its emotional stakes intensified. Its action sequences sharpened. And the captain at the center of it all felt, well, he felt like someone NBC could build a series around. There's a moment in the Herb Solow and Bob Justman's book Inside Star Trek, subtle but powerful, when the creative team describes watching Shatner perform scenes from the second pilot. You can feel the room leaning forward. Something had clicked. He wasn't imitating Jeffrey Hunter. He wasn't reshaping what came before. He was defining something new, something that would become the heartbeat of the series. The captain didn't have to brood. He didn't have to project solemnity. He didn't have to sit under the weight of destiny. He could stride. He could joke. He could command with quick instincts and sharp warmth. He could look danger in the eye and say, "Let's see what's out there." Kirk was born not out of calculation, but out of chemistry, out of charisma, out of the natural cadence Shatner brought to a universe that needed a little fire. And when NBC reviewed the second pilot, that fire was undeniable. The very things they had asked for, energy, accessibility, action, Shatner delivered with instinctive ease. That was the turning point. Not the technical improvements, not the story changes, not even the better pacing. It was the captain. Shatner didn't just take over the role, he anchored the show. Without him, the second pilot might have been stronger than the cage, but still not strong enough. With him, it became undeniable. And here's the part I always think about late at night when I'm reflecting on Trek history. If Hunter had stayed, if the show had followed the original tone, if the captain had remained quiet and solemn, would Star Trek have survived long enough to become a phenomenon? It's impossible to know. Shatner's casting wasn't just a replacement, it was a rescue, a recalibration of the entire identity of the show. He made exploring the unknown feel thrilling rather than burdensome. He gave command to humanity that audiences could rally behind. He brought laughter, swagger, and vulnerability into the same scene, sometimes the same line. He made the Enterprise feel like a ship you wanted to be aboard. And when the cameras rolled, everything changed. The captain was no longer a man weighed down by duty. He was a man propelled by curiosity. And in that shift, Star Trek found the voice it had been reaching for since the very beginning. That's the magic of this moment, a moment the Herb Solow and Bob Justman's book Inside Star Trek captures with quiet detail and surprising candor. A man walked away. A crisis hit. And out of that crisis, a legend stepped in. Not because Shatner was inevitable, but because he was right. Right for the tone, right for the chemistry, right for the adventure, right for the universe that needed someone to stand on the bridge and say, with conviction and a spark in his eye,
Ahead. Warp Factor 1.
"Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. Lucille Ball saved Star Trek, but no one talks about what it cost her." The following video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. Star Trek didn't kill Desilu, but it came closer than anyone admitted. Behind the scenes, the studio was sinking under its biggest hit. Anytime I feel like Star Trek's early years were some simple underdog victory tale, all I have to do is go back into Inside Star Trek by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. It's all there. The exhaustion, the panic, the exhilaration, and the quiet, creeping dread of a studio realizing it might not survive the very show it had fought to put on the air. Desilu wasn't a powerhouse. It wasn't a major studio. It wasn't even particularly stable. By the time Star Trek came along, Desilu was already stretched thin, relying on a fragile balance of older hits and last chance gambles. And then this enormous, ambitious, visually demanding series walked through the door. and demanded everything. The book reveals this with a kind of gentle shock. Star Trek wasn't Desilu's success story. It was Desilu's burden. The show that changed television nearly broke the studio that birthed it. You see, Star Trek's cost wasn't just high, it was crushing. The book lays out the numbers like a quiet indictment. Star Trek cost far more per episode than the studio could afford. Way more than the network was willing to pay. And the gap between what NBC covered and what Star Trek required, Desilu had to eat that. Week after week. Episode after episode, a financial bleed that grew sharper with each production cycle. Desilu wasn't a giant like Paramount or Universal. It couldn't hide overruns behind a slate of blockbusters. It had Star Trek and debt. And the book shows a kind of mounting anxiety in the offices. People whispering, departments juggling invoices, executives postponing payments, accounting teams doing triage. Star Trek wasn't a show. It was a drain, a glorious drain, a visionary drain, but a drain all the same. You see, Desilu didn't have the infrastructure for a show this big. This is one of the most heartbreaking truths in the book. Star Trek required massive set changes, constant optical effects, new costumes every week, fresh planet environments, complicated lighting, prop fabrication, makeup experimentation, additional crew hours, overtime, and more overtime. Desilu didn't have a deep bench of technicians. It didn't have storage space. It didn't have enough sound stages. It didn't have the financial flexibility to expand infrastructure. Every time Star Trek asked for more sets, more time, more effects, Desilu had to make impossible choices. Cut elsewhere, delay payments, shuffle resources. The studio wasn't being irresponsible. It was being overwhelmed. The real problem was the Star Trek schedule never let up. Star Trek didn't shoot like a normal show. It didn't slot neatly into a calendar. Scripts arrived late. Rewrites came at midnight. Sets were redressed frantically. Production days ran long. Crew hours ballooned. The book revisits this again and again. The idea that Star Trek wasn't just over budget. It was out of control in a way no small studio could sustain. Every late script cost Desilu money. Every blown shooting day cost Desilu money. Every makeup tweak cost Desilu money. Every optical shot cost money Desilu did not have. Large studios absorbed that. Desilu could not. And all those NBC network notes made everything worse. The book shows just how destructive NBC's constant interference became, not artistically, but financially. Standards and practices demanded changes. Story editors argued, scenes were reshot, makeup redone, set pieces rebuilt, all on Desilu's dime. NBC paid the license fee. Desilu paid for the problems, and Star Trek had a lot of problems. This wasn't negligence, it was ambition. Roddenberry dreamed big. Coon wrote big. The directors shot big. The cast acted big, and Desilu's bank account shrank big. Unfortunately, Desilu's other shows weren't enough to save it. This is where the book turned somber. Lucille Ball believed in Star Trek, deeply, emotionally, against the advice of shareholders and colleagues, but belief doesn't pay bills. Other Desilu productions weren't earning enough to offset Star Trek's costs. There weren't enough hits to keep the studio afloat. Television was shifting, and Desilu couldn't keep up. The book's tone shifts here, from sympathetic to melancholy. Desilu took a chance on something ahead of its time, but the future is expensive. As time passed, the cash flow collapsed. The book makes this bluntly clear. Payments from NBC came slowly. Production invoices came quickly. Vendors demanded money Desilu didn't have. Departments waited for checks that never arrived. Overruns ballooned into deficits. It wasn't mismanagement. It was math. Star Trek cost more to make than Desilu could afford, and without major outside investment, the studio had no pathway to sustainability. And on top of all that, Star Trek's renewal was a double-edged sword. This is the cruelest twist in the book. NBC renewed the show for color television economics, as we saw, but that renewal also chained Desilu to another year of crippling expense. Season 2 didn't rescue the studio. It accelerated its collapse. Lucille Ball may have won the battle to keep Star Trek alive, but Desilu paid with its future. Every week of production dug the hole deeper. Renewal felt like hope. In reality, it was the final straw. No matter how desperate Lucy was to save her studio, the sale was inevitable. The book begins to speak in hushed tones as it approaches this realization. There's no anger, no blame, no dramatic language, just a solemn understanding. Desilu couldn't survive Star Trek, not in its existing form, not with its existing finances, not with its existing structure. They needed a buyer, a rescue, a parent company with deeper pockets. And that buyer was Paramount. The book doesn't linger on the deal. It doesn't dramatize it. It simply acknowledges that the sale was the only way to keep Star Trek alive and prevent Desilu from sinking entirely. Lucille Ball had fought hard for the show. She believed in it more than the network did. But belief wasn't enough. Desilu needed to be saved because Star Trek was too big for it to hold. The emotional truth behind it all. What moves me most in the book is this. Desilu didn't fail because it didn't believe in Star Trek. It failed because it believed too much. Lucille Ball fought for the pilot. She fought for the second pilot. She fought for the production. She fought for the renewal. She fought for Roddenberry. She fought for the writers. She fought for the actors. She protected Star Trek. And Star Trek, unknowingly, pushed her studio beyond its limits. The show that needed saving ultimately needed saving from itself. Star Trek was too ambitious, too imaginative, too costly, too ahead of its time. Desilu gave it everything it had. Everything. And in giving everything, Desilu lost itself. But without Desilu, without that risk, that sacrifice, that willingness to bleed money for a dream, Star Trek would never have existed at all. Desilu's downfall was Star Trek's beginning. The studio didn't die because Star Trek failed. It died because Star Trek succeeded too beautifully. Spock was the face of the show, and yet, at one point, they were preparing to lose him. And the scramble to replace him reveals everything about Star Trek's fragile early days.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. There's a thread running through the book that feels almost like a heartbeat, steady at first, then anxious, then pounding. It appears each time Leonard Nimoy's name comes up, especially when the story turns toward those uneasy months when the production feared it might lose him. The entire atmosphere changes. Voices tighten. Memos grow sharper. You can feel the tension rising like a pressure wave under the floorboards. Spock wasn't just another character. He wasn't interchangeable. He wasn't optional. He was the axis the show rotated around, visually, emotionally, philosophically. And the terrifying truth that the book reveals is this. There was a moment when the studio genuinely believed Nimoy was leaving, and they quietly began preparing for life without him. It's almost painful to imagine, but it happened. And the book chronicles this story with raw honesty. Let me take you back to those early days after The Cage. The first pilot. NBC had reservations about almost everything in it. The story, the pacing, the cerebral tone, the characters. But there was one thing, one silhouette, one presence they couldn't ignore. Spock. Even when they called him too devilish, even when they questioned the ears, the eyebrows, and the strange intensity he brought to the screen, the network kept circling back to him. Spock mesmerized them. The executives were confused by him, maybe even unsettled, but fascinated nonetheless. The book makes this tension clear. NBC didn't entirely understand Spock, but they knew he mattered. So when the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, was ordered, Nimoy was the only cast member from The Cage they insisted on keeping. This reality was very different from the story Roddenberry was spreading around that they wanted him gone, and he was fighting to keep him. But they wanted him changed, softened, humanized. They didn't want the demonic look, didn't want the original severity, didn't want audiences to recoil. That pressure alone might have driven some actors away. Nimoy stood in a very strange place, beloved yet threatened, central yet questioned. And then came the negotiations. Contracts aren't emotional things, but the book paints these negotiations as borderline traumatic. Nimoy had leverage, real leverage. NBC wanted him. The producers needed him. Roddenberry adored him. But the contract discussions dragged on, complicated by everything from pay to credit to personal concerns. The studio tried subtle tactics, then not so subtle tactics, then borderline psychological ones. The book captures this chilling detail. While still trying to secure Nimoy, they quietly began auditioning replacements. Not openly, not loudly, but in whispers, inside meetings, in quiet conversations after hours. And two names emerged, two men who could, in theory, step into the role if the unthinkable happened. Mark Leonard, Larry Montaigne. Reading those lines hits hard, because the book doesn't treat this as rumor. It's fact. The production genuinely began mapping out what a Spockless Star Trek might look like. And you can feel the fear between the lines, because everyone knew what was at stake. Spock wasn't just the alien. He was the emotional counterweight to Kirk, the ideological foil for McCoy, the embodiment of Roddenberry's future: logic, control, compassion beneath restraint. Losing him would have ripped out the spine of the show, and yet the fear was real enough that they started auditioning shadows. Montaigne had the cheekbones, the coolness, the angular features. Leonard had the gravitas, the natural authority, the voice that could cut through turbulence. But as the book makes painfully clear, neither could replicate what Nimoy brought. Not the stillness, not the depth. Not the strange mix of warmth and distance that made Spock feel alive. But the contingency planning continued, because the negotiations kept stalling. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into dread. And somewhere in those discussions, the book tells us something subtle but profound. The moment Roddenberry realized that losing Nimoy wasn't just a casting problem, it was a vision problem. Now, Spock represented the dream Roddenberry wanted to show the world. A humanity that embraced difference. A future where being other wasn't a burden, but a strength. A character who walked between two worlds, human and Vulcan, mirroring Roddenberry's own belief that humanity could bridge any divide. So losing Nimoy wasn't losing an actor. It was losing the ideology of the show. And that's when Roddenberry dug in. He refused to build a universe that didn't include Spock. But the studio didn't see it that way at first. They were thinking budgets and contracts. Roddenberry was thinking myth-making. And that disconnect nearly tore everything apart. The book describes late-night meetings, Producers pacing, desperation creeping in, people trying to hide their worry from the rest of the cast. And Nimoy? He stayed quiet, professional, thoughtful, not dramatic, not combative, but firm. He knew his value, knew the character's value, knew how deeply the show needed him, and somewhere in that tense middle ground, NBC tried a tactic that now feels almost absurd. They attempted to bluff, a quiet whisper here.
We have alternatives.
An implication there.
We can recast the alien.
A hint elsewhere.
Maybe the role isn't as irreplaceable as you think.
But the book reveals the truth behind those whispers. Nobody believed it. Not the producers. Not the crew. Not even NBC, deep down. The replacements were good actors, but the heart wasn't there. The chemistry wasn't there. The alchemy wasn't there. This wasn't a role. It was a presence. Then comes the part of the book that always hits me hardest. The moment when the production team, feeling the wall closing in, privately admitted that losing Nimoy might mean losing the show itself. If Spock disappeared, Star Trek might survive, but it wouldn't live. You can feel the emotion rising in those recollections, a sense of protectiveness around Nimoy that transcended business. He wasn't just the guy with the ears, he was the compass, the anchor, the one who made Roddenberry's universe feel grounded, believable, and achingly complicated. And then, finally, the contract landed. And the book doesn't give the dramatic flourish of triumph. It gives relief. Quiet, exhausted, grateful relief. People exhaling, shoulders unclenching, the producers smiling for the first time in days. Spock was staying, and the bridge felt whole again. When filming resumed, the energy shifted. Nimoy returned to set with the steadiness he always carried. Shatner relaxed into the rapport that made their dynamic iconic. The writers breathed easier, knowing they hadn't lost their philosophical center. And those two replacement names, Leonard and Montaigne, they didn't vanish. The book hints at something almost poetic. They would eventually appear in the show, but never as Spock. Their talent had a place in the universe, but not in the role that only Nimoy could embody. That's the beauty of the story. The battle to keep Nimoy wasn't about ego. It wasn't about contracts. It wasn't about winning a negotiation. It was about maintaining the balance of Star Trek. Hi, this is Jim from Trek World. When she walked onto the Star Trek set, her name wasn't Uhura, and nothing about her role was guaranteed. But one quiet decision changed television history forever. The following video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. There's a gentle pulse running through the book the moment the topic of Uhura and Nichelle Nichols comes into the story. It's not loud, not dramatic, not framed as a turning point with trumpets or declarations. Instead, it arrives quietly, almost like a breath the show didn't realize it had been holding. It's described with a kind of warm inevitability, as though Star Trek had been waiting for her long before she ever walked into the room. And I'll be honest, reading that section always stirs something in me. You can almost feel the energy shift around her, the sense that the show suddenly gained color, confidence, rhythm, and a more human heartbeat. Not because anyone announced it, not because anyone decided it, but because it simply happened. But what's most fascinating is that none of it began with certainty. It began with a question. What should her name be? The book captures this naming moment like a snapshot, a creative discussion unfolding in real time. Ideas are floated casually. Possibilities drift through the room. Some names feel too familiar. Some feel too stiff. Some feel like they belong to another genre entirely. She wasn't Uhura at first. That name, the one that would later echo across generations, classrooms, conventions, and history books, arrived almost gently. It didn't crash into the conversation. It wasn't argued into place. It emerged lightly, organically, almost incidentally. But once it appeared, it stuck. And that's the thing about the best creative decisions. They often don't announce themselves as important. They don't feel monumental in the moment. They feel right. Quietly right. As if the room collectively recognizes something true without needing to explain it. Names matter. Identity matters, especially on that bridge. Star Trek was inventing a future from whole cloth. Every uniform, every console, every title carried weight, and in that context, a name wasn't just a label. It was an identity, a tone, a promise. And in the book, the moment they land on Uhura feels like the room exhaling, like they'd found something elegant, melodic, distinctly hers, a name with sound and shape and dignity. A name that didn't feel borrowed from the past or trapped in the present. Something that didn't belong to any single era, but felt timeless. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't gimmicky. It didn't shout. It sang. And once that name existed, the character began to take shape around it. Then the casting discussion begins. And this is where the book grows more intimate. Because Nichelle Nichols wasn't cast for representation. Though she would become one of the most enduring symbols of it, she wasn't cast as a statement. She wasn't cast because the show needed to make a point. She was cast because she belonged on that bridge. Because she had the presence, the poise, the intelligence, and the voice that the communications post demanded. And the book reflects this in the simplest possible way. She fit. There's no political speech buried in the margins. No grand debate about social messaging. No arguments about optics versus entertainment. Just a straightforward recognition that this woman carried something essential. Something Star Trek needed if it was going to feel like a living, breathing future. The future couldn't just be machines and uniforms. It needed people. And Nichelle Nichols brought humanity into the room the moment she arrived. When the book recalls her earliest moments on set, there's an unspoken admiration woven through the language. Not admiration that calls attention to itself, but the kind that shows up in how little explanation is needed. The way she carried herself. The way she inhabited the uniform. The way she sat at the console, composed, alert, unflustered. There's a calm described there that feels like authority without force. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. She didn't need to assert herself to be felt. She simply was. And what I love most is how naturally the book describes her integration into the ensemble. She wasn't treated like an outsider stepping into something fragile. She wasn't handled delicately or cautiously. She became part of the family almost immediately. The right energy, the right tone, the right chemistry. And yet, beneath that calm surface, there were hurdles. Because while the creative team recognized what they had, the world outside that soundstage wasn't quite as settled. The network, already nervous about bold creative moves like Number One, now had to contend with something different, but just as culturally charged. A woman of color on the bridge. Not as background, not as decoration, not as a silent technician, but as a senior officer. Calm, competent, essential. You can sense the hesitation in parts of the book, not always spoken outright, but hovering just beneath the surface. Questions about how audiences might react, whether affiliates would complain, whether viewers would embrace or resist this vision of the future. NBC didn't block the casting, but they watched, they measured. They waited. Roddenberry didn't waver, the creative team didn't flinch, and the actors around her didn't hesitate. Uhura was Starfleet. She was the future, and she was staying. But her rise wasn't just about casting. It was about shaping the role itself. The book shows how the writers slowly discovered where Uhura lived within the rhythm of the bridge. Communications wasn't just pushing buttons or relaying sensor readings. It required interpretation. judgment, focus under pressure. And through that, her character found a steady rhythm. Uhura became something quietly vital. She wasn't loud. She wasn't intrusive. She didn't dominate scenes. But she was always present. She became the bridge's emotional temperature gauge, the still point amid chaos. When danger escalated, she grounded the moment. When uncertainty crept in, her calm delivery gave the crew something solid to lean on. And her interactions mattered. The book highlights subtle exchanges, moments with Kirk, with Spock, with Solow, where her lines weren't just functional, but anchoring. Human threads woven into tension-filled scenes. Those moments didn't happen by accident. They happened because the writers recognized the emotional gravity she brought, the way her voice could soften urgency, the way her presence could heighten stakes without adding noise. And then there's the naming again. Because Uhura didn't just identify her, it shaped her. It gave the character a cultural weight that extended far beyond the script pages. A name like that didn't belong to the 1960s. It wasn't a celebrity mashup. It wasn't shorthand. It wasn't accidental. It felt intentional, new, but familiar. Warm, but dignified. Bold, but gentle. The book almost lingers there, as if recognizing something special had been set in motion, something whose full impact wouldn't be felt for years. You can sense the respect they had for her even then, before the audience ever met her, before history caught up. There's a moment later in the book that always stops me. Someone describes the first time all the actors were assembled on the bridge set together. The uniforms, the consoles, the lighting, the symmetry, and the sight of Nichelle Nichols in uniform sitting at her station completed the picture. As if the visual palette finally snapped into balance. She wasn't decoration. She wasn't background. She was command environment, and the actors around her treated her that way instinctively. She had the bearing of Starfleet, which in 1966 was radical without ever announcing itself as such. But the book also doesn't shy away from the quieter challenges. The bridge set wasn't designed with her comfort in mind. Long hours seated at the console, hot studio lights, constant adjustments to makeup under Desilu's unforgiving illumination, wig work that required patience and precision. And because the writers were still discovering who Uhura was, her prominence shifted from episode to episode. Some days she was central, some days supportive, some days nearly silent, some days pivotal, and through it all, she did the work with grace. The book returns again and again to a single theme, her professionalism. Nichelle showed up prepared, warm, patient, engaged. She didn't fight for attention. She didn't demand more lines. She didn't need to assert her importance. She simply was important, and everyone felt it. This is where the emotional depth of the book becomes unmistakable. Because while she wasn't written as the intellectual mirror of Spock or the command voice of Kirk, she carried something else, something equally essential. Steadiness, compassion, humanness. Uhura was the reminder that exploration wasn't just about charts and phasers. It was about connection, about understanding, about communication, literal and emotional. The bridge could be a place of quiet chaos. Uhura was the still point, calm, controlled, present. She made Starfleet feel human, and the book suggests that once the name Uhura settled into place, it subtly guided the writers. It became a tonal anchor, a reference point, soft vowels, musical rhythm, linguistic warmth. And her scenes began to reflect that quality. There's a sequence described, a simple exchange during a tense moment. She takes a reading, delivers it calmly. The energy in the room shifts. The book doesn't frame it as heroic, but the effect is unmistakable. Everyone listens. Everyone trusts her. She belonged there. And over time, the network's hesitation faded. Audiences didn't react with shock. They didn't recoil. They didn't protest. They accepted her. More than that, they embraced her. Because Uhura wasn't a token. She wasn't a message. She wasn't a symbol forced onto the screen. She was part of the family. And the book holds that truth gently, quietly, without embellishment. That's the real power of her rise. Not fireworks, not declarations, but warmth. Not speeches, but presence. Nichelle Nichols didn't need a spotlight to shine. She stepped onto the bridge, and the light found her. Star Trek didn't give her power. She brought power to Star Trek. The network had made up its mind, but the fans hadn't, and their quiet rebellion changed television history.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. One of the things I love most about digging into the book is how Star Trek's survival wasn't just a production miracle. It was a human one. That truth surfaces like a pulse through every recollection. You can feel the exhaustion of the cast, the strain on the writers, the budget fires burning under the feet of the producers. But there's a moment, a quiet, almost fragile moment, when everything shifts. The studio was ready to let Star Trek go. NBC had seen the numbers. They didn't like what they saw. But the viewers refused to accept it. And that's what makes the story so moving. Star Trek wasn't saved by executives, or advertisers, or clever press releases. It was saved by people. Ordinary people who believed in something extraordinary. A show they loved was dying, and they couldn't let it happen. The book doesn't frame the Save Star Trek campaign like a mythic uprising. It describes it the way it actually felt to the people living through it. A quiet, desperate plea. Handwritten letters, typed notes, postmarked envelopes, arriving in steady clusters, and then, suddenly, impossible waves. At first, it wasn't even organized. It was impulse, instinct, a feeling of loss creeping in before the curtain had even fallen. And at the center of this rising tide were fans who refused to remain passive. The book captures their urgency beautifully. How word of mouth turned into momentum. How small viewing groups suddenly became activist cells. How informal gatherings became planning sessions. They weren't trying to make history, they were trying to save Thursdays. And somewhere in that early swell of concern, two names begin weaving through the book like twin beacons, Bejo Trimble and John Trimble. Now, the book doesn't dwell on them for long, but the thread is unmistakable. It hints at this incredible transformation. One moment they were viewers, the next they were organizers. They didn't have resources. They didn't have sponsors. They had typewriters, address books, and a willingness to do the impossible. The studio didn't take them seriously at first. Fans weren't viewed as a force. They were a background hum, appreciated but rarely respected. That changed almost overnight. Because the letters didn't stop. They multiplied. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands, and thousands became a flood. The book recalls the shock in NBC's mailroom. Staff overwhelmed, clerks carting bins of letters that kept arriving day after day. No one had ever seen anything like it. These weren't pre-printed forms or mass-produced petitions. They were personal, thoughtful, heartfelt. People wrote about what the show meant to them, what Spock meant to them, what exploring the unknown meant to them. And NBC suddenly found itself staring at something it had never encountered before, a grassroots movement. The book recounts the disbelief. Executives called meetings, analytics people reviewed data, publicity departments tried to understand what was happening. Television was supposed to be one-way communication. But now, unbelievably, the audience was talking back. And they weren't whispering. They were shouting. The book describes one moment that almost feels cinematic. NBC issuing an unprecedented public announcement begging fans to stop sending letters. Not because they didn't care, but because the volume was so overwhelming the network couldn't process it. Imagine that. A major American network pleading with its own viewers to ease up. That's when the producers realized something profound. Star Trek had become more than a show. It had become a conversation. And the fans, those unseen millions, had found their voice. Inside Desilu, the book shows how the atmosphere changed. Writers who had been bracing for cancellation suddenly felt hope crackling under the tension. Cast members, tired, worn thin, discovered they weren't alone. The crew, who had fought tooth and nail just to finish episodes on time, suddenly understood that the universe they were building mattered deeply to people they would never meet. Roddenberry, in particular, felt it. The book captures subtle shifts in his language, his frustration giving way to gratitude, his exhaustion softening into resolve. He knew the show had potential, but he didn't know, not really, how deeply it had touched viewers until the letters began arriving. And they didn't just arrive, they overwhelmed. NBC wasn't prepared for this. They were prepared for apathy. They weren't prepared for passion. And while the book maintains the quiet professionalism of the era, no fireworks, no dramatic speeches, you can sense the emotional weight of every letter that arrived. There's a moment the book describes where executives placed boxes of fan mail on a conference table and simply stared at them, silent, thinking, realizing they were on the wrong side of history. Because here's the truth the book reveals so elegantly. Star Trek survived not because it was profitable, but because it was loved. And that love, relentless, insistent, organized, forced NBC's hand. But this wasn't just a fan victory. It was a production victory, too. Writers who had been fighting battles with scripts and deadlines now found new fire. Nimoy, whose presence had been so fragile in contract negotiations, suddenly felt the weight of the character's meaning. Shatner saw what the captain symbolized. The production team felt buoyed by a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were building something lasting. Even the tension between the behind-the-scenes personalities softened. Justman, Roddenberry, and the exhausted writing staff found themselves united by something larger than their conflicts. The book frames this beautifully, a moment when the show finally realized it wasn't alone. But here's what I find most powerful in the book. The fans never demanded changes, never demanded characters be rewritten, never demanded storylines bend to their will. All they demanded was that the show continue, that the journey not end prematurely, that the vision not be snuffed out, that the Enterprise be allowed to keep flying. And NBC listened. Under pressure, both external and internal, the network renewed Star Trek. The campaign had done the impossible. No one had ever seen anything like it. No show had ever been saved by its audience on the scale. And the book gives this moment a quiet reverence. Not triumphant, but grateful. Because it wasn't a victory lap. It was a breath of relief. The cast returned with renewed purpose. The crew returned with renewed energy. And the fans? The fans proved that television didn't have to be a one-direction broadcast. It could be a conversation, A relationship, a shared dream. The Enterprise wasn't just a set of characters exploring the galaxy. She was carrying an audience with her, one letter at a time. And that's why this story still resonates so powerfully. The Save Star Trek campaign wasn't about ratings. It wasn't about advertising. It wasn't about numbers on a board. It was about connection, about meaning, about ordinary people standing up to say, this matters. And it worked, not through force, but through passion, through persistence, through an outpouring of belief in a future worth imagining. In the end, the book leaves us with a truth that feels almost sacred. Star Trek lived because its fans refused to let it die. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. He wasn't hired for his phasers. He wasn't hired for his accent. He was hired because Star Trek needed a Beatle. The following video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. There's a strange kind of honesty hidden in the smallest production details of Star Trek. Not in the big speeches, not in the grand themes, but in the moments that feel almost embarrassing to admit. One of those moments is this. Star Trek added Chekov because of his hair. Not his talent, not his accent, not a carefully planned character arc. His hair. Whenever Star Trek is remembered as a fearless creative triumph, this story quietly reminds us how close the show always was to slipping out of existence. Because Chekov wasn't born from storytelling ambition. He was born from pressure, from ratings anxiety, from a network looking at a changing world and saying, you need to catch up. By the end of the first season, Star Trek was alive. But it wasn't safe. NBC liked the show. Critics admired it. A loyal audience had formed. But the numbers weren't where the network wanted them, especially in the one demographic that mattered most to advertisers in the mid-1960s, young viewers. Television was no longer being shaped by adults alone. Youth culture had become the engine driving fashion, music, language, and spending power. And towering over all of it were four men from Liverpool. The Beatles weren't just popular, they were transformational. They redefined what young people looked like, how they behaved, and what they responded to. Their influence didn't stop at music. It reshaped film, television, advertising, and identity itself. And NBC understood something very clearly. If Star Trek couldn't speak to youth culture, it didn't have a long-term future. So the network made a request that was blunt, practical, and deeply revealing. They wanted someone young, someone energetic, someone contemporary, someone who looked like he belonged in the same cultural moment as the audience they were chasing. In plain terms, Star Trek needed a Beatle. This wasn't framed as a creative opportunity. It wasn't discussed as character development. It was a survival tactic. The producers understood exactly what the network meant. They didn't want depth. They didn't want lore. They wanted hair, longer hair, forward-falling hair, hair that felt modern instead of militaristic, hair that said, this show isn't just for your parents. And so, the search began. Not for a navigator, not for a Russian officer, but for a look. When Walter Koenig entered the room, the decision was almost immediate. The hair was right. It had softness, youth, a casual confidence. He looked like someone who could exist comfortably in the same world as the Monkees or the Beatles without seeming out of place. That alone got him noticed. Inside Star Trek doesn't dress this up. There's no myth-making here. The producers weren't embarrassed, but they weren't pretending otherwise either. This was a network-driven decision, made in response to cultural reality. But here's where the story becomes something more than cynical. Because hair might open the door, but it doesn't keep you there. When Koenig read, something clicked. He wasn't just young. He was sharp, present, sincere. There was an intelligence to him that wasn't flashy, but felt grounded. He didn't try to dominate the room. He didn't push for attention. He listened. And that mattered. Star Trek's producers weren't willing to gamble the integrity of the show for a fashion trend. If this new edition couldn't carry himself on the bridge, the idea would die there. It didn't. Koenig brought a natural curiosity, a sense of eagerness that felt authentic in a story about exploration. He wasn't burdened by command or philosophy. He was thrilled to be part of something bigger than himself. The network wanted hair. The producers found a presence. Still, the hair remained non-negotiable. Koenig was asked to keep it long, styled forward, carefully maintained. This wasn't vanity. It was visual language. It told the audience instantly that this character represented something different. Not authority, not experience, but possibility. Of course, that created problems. Studio lighting wasn't designed for bangs. Shadows fell unpredictably across his face. Continuity became a daily challenge. Under the hot lights, the hair trapped heat. Crew members joked about his bangs lifting in unseen drafts behind the set walls. But no one complained. Everyone understood the trade. Chekov wasn't added to replace anyone. He wasn't there to steal focus. He was there to change the feel of the show, to introduce a sense of youth into a universe that often carried enormous intellectual and emotional weight. He wasn't there to command. He was there to react. And that reaction mattered, because Star Trek, for all its vision, could feel heavy. Ethical debates, moral dilemmas, philosophical standoffs. Chekov's enthusiasm softened those edges. He brought energy, optimism, a sense that the future wasn't just being analyzed, it was being experienced. Interestingly, the Russian identity came later. Inside Star Trek makes it clear that this wasn't the original hook. The cultural role came first. The nationality was layered on afterward, adding a Cold War irony that made the network slightly uneasy. But Chekov was never meant to be political. He was meant to be young. That youthfulness did something subtle, but profound. It shifted the tone of the bridge. Suddenly the Enterprise felt inhabited by generations, not just ranks. Kirk carried responsibility. Spock carried logic. McCoy carried weariness. Chekov carried wonder. And that wonder radiated outward. The cast felt it almost immediately. He wasn't treated like a gimmick. He became the younger brother. Nimoy and Kelly teased him warmly. Shatner enjoyed playing off his enthusiasm. Nichols welcomed the new energy. The ensemble adjusted naturally. Chekov didn't disrupt the chemistry. He refreshed it. And audiences noticed. Younger viewers responded. Letters came in. NBC saw movement in the demographics they cared about most. The experiment, hair, and all worked. But what's most striking isn't the success. It's the vulnerability behind it. Because this decision wasn't made from a place of confidence. It was made from a place of uncertainty. Star Trek didn't add Chekov because it wanted to chase trends. It added him because the ground beneath the show was shifting. This is what Inside Star Trek captures so well. Greatness didn't arrive fully formed. It survived by adapting. Chekov's haircut became a symbol of that adaptability. A commercial demand transformed into genuine character. A network note turned into mythology. And now, decades later, Chekov feels inevitable. Natural. Essential. But he wasn't inevitable. He was a risk. A concession. A quiet acknowledgement that even visionary shows sometimes have to bend just enough to keep going. The Beatles didn't just change music. In a small, unlikely way, they helped Star Trek survive long enough to change everything. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. Every week, Star Trek waited to be canceled, and no one knew if tomorrow would come. The following video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. There's a particular kind of tension that never quite leaves the early history of Star Trek. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't appear in memos or budgets or ratings charts, but it's there, woven into every recollection, every book, every half-remembered story from the Desilu lot. It's the tension of not knowing if tomorrow exists. From the very beginning, Star Trek lived under the shadow of cancellation, not as a distant possibility, not as an abstract fear, but as a constant presence, something felt in every department, every rehearsal, every rewrite. Every Thursday felt like it could be the last, and that fear shaped everything. Star Trek didn't grow in a safe environment. It wasn't nurtured by confidence or protected by network faith. It was built week to week, episode to episode, by people who understood deeply that nothing about the show was guaranteed. The Enterprise flew not on certainty, but on hope, duct tape, and the belief that maybe, just maybe, there would be another episode to make. The fear began before the show even existed. One of the most sobering truths in the book is how early the anxiety set in. Long before audiences ever saw the Enterprise, long before the theme music became iconic, long before Star Trek meant anything at all, NBC saw the budgets first. They saw the scale, the complexity, the ambition, and they panicked. Science fiction made them nervous. It felt expensive, risky, hard to explain. They worried viewers wouldn't follow the stories. They worried the dialogue was too intelligent. They worried about Spock, his ears, his demeanor, his lack of overt emotion. They worried the show was cold, abstract, unrelatable. They even worried about the colors. The book makes it clear. NBC's doubts weren't subtle. They weren't hidden. They were expressed early and often, and those doubts didn't stay confined to executive offices. They traveled downward, quietly, relentlessly, until everyone felt them. Producers sensed it. Writers sensed it. Roddenberry sensed it immediately. Before Star Trek ever aired, it was already being evaluated as a potential failure, and that knowledge settled in. A show created under suspicion. Star Trek was never treated as a sure thing. It was treated as a question mark, something the network was willing to try, but not fully trust. That suspicion shaped the show's earliest decisions. Scripts were scrutinized harder. Budgets were questioned more aggressively. Creative risks were constantly weighed against fear of alienating the audience. Nothing was assumed safe. Every episode had to justify itself. Not artistically, but economically. That's a brutal environment to create in. And yet, it's the environment Star Trek was born into. The book doesn't describe optimism in those early weeks. It describes vigilance, caution, a sense that the show was being watched closely, not with excitement, but with skepticism. And that skepticism never went away. The writers wrote like they were on a sinking ship. If there's one place where the fear is most palpable, it's in the writer's room. The book describes a space defined by urgency. Scripts weren't just stories, they were arguments. Every episode was a plea for survival. Look what we can do, the show seemed to say. Just give us one more week. Writers didn't have the luxury of long development cycles. Ideas had to land immediately. Themes had to resonate fast. Every script needed to prove that Star Trek was worth the risk. That pressure explains so much about the show's tone, the boldness, the experimentation, the willingness to tackle moral questions most television avoided. It wasn't confidence driving those choices. It was desperation. Fear sharpened the writing. It stripped away hesitation. If this might be the last episode, then it had to matter. And that urgency became part of Star Trek's DNA. The cast lived in a constant state of limbo. The actors felt it too. The book doesn't dramatize this. It simply allows the unease to surface in recollection, in careful wording, in memories shaped by decades of hindsight. No one knew if contracts would be renewed. No one knew if the show would last. No one knew if they should plan for the future or prepare to move on. Every Friday could have been the end. William Shatner carried that weight quietly, knowing the responsibility of anchoring a show under scrutiny. Leonard Nimoy felt it through contract tensions and constant questions about Spock's place on the series. Nichelle Nichols, DeForest Kelley, James Doohan, George Takei, each of them worked under the same uncertainty. They weren't building icons. They were fighting for another week of work. That emotional reality shaped performances in ways no script could describe. Scenes were played with urgency because urgency was real. Stakes felt high because they were. They acted like every episode mattered because it did. The crew felt the pressure most of all. If the cast lived with fear, the crew lived with exhaustion. The book speaks with quiet respect about the technicians, builders, designers, and craftspeople who carried the show physically forward. They weren't just creating sets. They were creating them under impossible schedules. Everything moved too fast. Everything cost too much. Everything felt temporary. Rumors circulated constantly. NBC was unhappy. NBC was reconsidering. NBC was evaluating options. Each rumor tightened the pressure. Each delay amplified the stress. The crew worked not knowing if their efforts would ever be seen beyond the next broadcast. They didn't slow down anyway. They worked like every hour mattered because it did. Ratings were a weekly emotional whiplash. The book reveals just how unstable the ratings picture was. Numbers rose and fell unpredictably. A strong episode sparked hope. A weak time slot erased it. There was no momentum, only reaction. Every ratings report felt like judgment. Every dip felt like danger. Every rise brought only brief relief. NBC used those fluctuations as leverage. Cut this, simplify that, adjust the tone, humanize this character, reduce this cost. The production was never allowed to feel secure. Star Trek didn't exist in a steady state. It existed on a roller coaster. Renewal didn't mean safety. Even renewal didn't bring peace. The book is clear on this point. NBC's renewals were strategic, not supportive. They were business decisions tied to color television economics, not endorsements of faith. The network still questioned the scripts, still questioned the budget, still questioned Spock, still questioned the audience. Season 2 did not ease the anxiety. It intensified it, because now the pressure came with expectation, and the fear of failure grew sharper. Internal strain multiplied the fear. Behind the scenes, tensions grew. Roddenberry battled the network. Roddenberry battled writers. Writers battled time. Departments battled budgets. Fear didn't unite everyone. It wore them down. Scripts arrived late. Rewrites came later. Departments scrambled. Schedules slipped. The book captures a team stretched thin, not by laziness or incompetence, but by relentless pressure. Cancellation wasn't abstract. It was personal. And yet, they kept going. This is where the book becomes almost reverent. Despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, despite the uncertainty, they kept going. No one phoned it in. No one stopped caring. No one abandoned the work. They fought fear with effort. That's why the episodes still feel alive today. They weren't created in comfort. They were created in vulnerability. Star Trek wasn't built by people who felt safe. It was built by people who refused to surrender. Fear shaped the soul of the show. The book makes something else clear. The show's themes weren't accidental. Urgency, mortality, moral choice under pressure, hope against impossible odds. These weren't abstractions. They were reflections of the production itself. Star Trek wasn't optimistic because it was secure. It was optimistic because hope was necessary for survival. The future tense courage of the series was forged in present tense fear. The audience became the lifeline. Then slowly, something changed. Letters arrived. Thoughtful responses. People connected. The cast and crew realized the fear wasn't theirs alone. The audience feared losing the show too. That realization mattered. It gave the work meaning beyond survival. The emotional truth. Star Trek didn't survive because the network believed in it. It didn't survive because the budget worked. It didn't survive because the schedule made sense. It survived because the people making it refused to let fear decide the future. They believed irrationally, stubbornly, beautifully that the show deserved to exist. Star Trek wasn't saved by security. It was saved by hope. He saved the show from collapsing, wrote its heartbeat, and then vanished from the spotlight. This is the story of Star Trek's unsung architect.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. There's a special kind of reverence in the book whenever Gene Coon's name appears. It's not loud, not dramatic, not wrapped in legend the way Roddenberry's is. Instead, it's quieter, like a ripple spreading across the surface of the show's chaotic production history, reminding you that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Coon wasn't the man in front of the camera. He wasn't the one whose name thundered through opening credits. And he wasn't the charismatic visionary pitching utopian futures to NBC. But the book makes it clear. Gene Coon was the soul builder, the structural architect, the stabilizer, the quiet genius who emerged in the middle of the storm, looked around, and said,
"Let's make this work."
And while Roddenberry supplied the dream, it was Coon who supplied the rhythm. What I love most about reading these behind-the-scenes recollections is the emotional undercurrent. See, Roddenberry was the philosopher, romantic, idealistic, evangelical about humanity's potential. But Coon was the storyteller, the builder, the craftsman who could take a half-formed concept, scattered script pages, budget constraints, and a ticking clock, and turn it all into an episode people would watch 50 years later. The beauty of Coon's contribution lies in how unassuming it was. He didn't walk into Star Trek trying to dominate it. He walked in trying to fix it. At the time he arrived, the book paints Star Trek as a show held together by stubbornness and caffeine. Scripts running late, writers burning out, memos flying like phasers set to kill. The pressure was enormous, and the cracks were already visible. Roddenberry, brilliant as he was, couldn't carry the writing load alone. No one could. And that's where Coon stepped in. He brought something the show desperately needed: structure. You can feel the relief in the way the book talks about him. The staff needed someone who could write quickly, write cleanly, write effectively, without demanding endless rewrites or philosophical sparring matches. They needed someone who could look at Roddenberry's ideals and translate them into episodes that moved. Coon did that. And he did it with a kind of quiet competence that made everyone breathe easier. No drama. No ego. No explosions of conflict. Just pages delivered on time. Stories that landed. And dialogue that felt effortlessly human. He wrote fast, but he never wrote cheap. The book treats this like a miracle, and in a way, it was. Because while Roddenberry grappled with the pressure of steering the ship, and while writers like Ellison and others clashed violently with the production process, Coon moved smoothly, confidently, almost invisibly. His presence became the glue that held everything together. The book highlights something else too. Something easy to miss, yet deeply revealing. Coon wasn't afraid to make the show funny when it needed humor. He didn't treat the future as a sterile place where everyone spoke in grand declarations. His characters teased each other, grumbled, joked, reacted like real people facing unreal situations. That texture matters. Without it, the world feels hollow. With it, the Enterprise becomes a living place, warm, unpredictable, human. The book even hints at a subtle shift in tone after Coon's arrival. Suddenly episodes had balance, tension mixed with levity, stakes mixed with character moments. There was breathing room in the drama, which only made the emotional beats hit harder. He didn't undermine Roddenberry's vision. He grounded it, and he did so with remarkable speed. The book repeatedly praises how Coon could turn drafts around in days, sometimes hours, while others took weeks and demanded heavy revision. This wasn't just efficiency, it was survival. A weekly television show doesn't wait for inspiration. It demands momentum. It demands structure. It demands someone who can look a deadline in the face and say,
"I've got this."
Coon always had it. There's a moment in the book, a small one, but it stays with me, where someone describes how Coon's pages would arrive with a kind of calm energy, not flashy, not overwritten, not crumbling under philosophy, just good storytelling, line after line of dialogue that actors could deliver easily, scenes that directors could film without headaches, emotional arcs that audiences could follow without confusion. He made Star Trek feel accessible without weakening its message. And then there's the emotional heat under the surface. The staff grew protective of him. You can sense that. They weren't just grateful. There was admiration, even affection. Coon treated the crew with respect. He treated the other writers as collaborators instead of obstacles. He listened. He adjusted. He delivered. All the while, he remained almost painfully humble. The book makes it clear that Coon didn't seek the spotlight. He wasn't trying to be the visionary. He wasn't trying to be the icon. He wasn't trying to rival Roddenberry's role. He was trying to make good television. And that humility, ironically, is what made him essential. But the war between Roddenberry and the writers created unavoidable tension, and Coon was caught in it more than once. Even though he rarely fought back, he understood the system, understood Roddenberry's protective instincts, understood the pressure hell of delivering a show that had already defied gravity just to get on the air. He didn't rebel against that system. He navigated it, silently, professionally, elegantly. That's why I think the book treats him like a stabilizing force, someone who lowered the temperature of every room he entered. Where others sparked conflict, he sparked collaboration. And the episodes that came out of that collaboration had a certain heartbeat to them, a warmth that complemented Roddenberry's idealism, where you can see it in the structural tightness the show developed. You can hear it in the emotional clarity of its dialogue. You can feel it in the rhythm of episodes that finally flowed. Coon didn't just shape stories, he shaped the shape of stories. And then something quietly heartbreaking happened. He left, not in an explosion of bitterness, not in a dramatic showdown, not in the kind of fiery disputes that marked other writer departures. He simply stepped away. And the book's tone when describing his exit is subdued, almost mournful, because everyone knew what they were losing. Once he was gone, the writing load grew heavier. The rewrites grew harsher. The fractures widened. The stability Coon brought, that invisible scaffolding, was suddenly gone. And the show felt it. Episodes became harder to wrangle. Tensions rose again. Roddenberry resumed far more of the load than was healthy, and staff who had once relied on Coon's steady pace found themselves struggling to hold things together. Yet Coon never complained, never demanded recognition, never tried to reclaim his role. He moved on, leaving behind a body of work that the book treats with deep, enduring respect. And that's what makes his legacy so haunting. Roddenberry was the visionary, but Coon was the builder. Roddenberry dreamed the world. Coon made that world walk, breathe, speak, and feel real. He didn't invent the philosophy. He invented the texture. He didn't write the manifesto. He wrote the humanity. He didn't demand credit. And so, he never got enough. But when you look back now, when you sift through the book and feel the emotional truth beneath its memories, you realize something. Star Trek would not be Star Trek without Gene Coon. Not in tone, not in shape, not in spirit. His fingerprints are everywhere, invisible and irreplaceable. He was the one who steadied the ship when the storm threatened to capsize it. He was the one who proved Star Trek could be weekly television, not just a beautiful idea. He was the one who took Roddenberry's future and gave it character, warmth, and beating heart. And he did all of it quietly, gracefully, humbly. Behind every Starfleet badge was chaos the cameras never showed. Mini dresses, toupees, censors, and missing wigs. This was the fashion battlefield of Star Trek.
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. Whenever I go back through the book, I'm reminded that Star Trek's costumes weren't just wardrobe choices. They were battlegrounds. Every tunic, every mini-dress, every wig perched precariously atop a sweating actor's head came with an entire history of arguments, compromises, and last-minute miracles. And what fascinates me most is how this war wasn't fought in silence. It was loud, messy, and strangely emotional. Because costumes weren't just fabric, they were identity, politics, and the struggle to define what a future humanity should look like. Let me take you back to those early days at Desilu, when the creative team gathered around sketches and swatches, trying to design a visual language that matched Roddenberry's ambitions. These weren't trivial decisions. They were asked to imagine clothing not just for characters, but for an utopian society. Something familiar yet aspirational. And if you listen closely to the book, you can hear the stress, the sighs, the frustration, the laughter that always sounded just a little too tired. The first wave of problems came from NBC's censors. It's easy to forget now, but 1960s network television wasn't built for daring wardrobe choices. The miniskirt era was only just taking shape, and Star Trek's early designs from William Ware Theiss pushed boundaries that the network wasn't sure America was ready for. And yet, Roddenberry insisted, absolutely insisted, that women in his future didn't dress modestly because modesty was no longer a prison. Censors disagreed. And so, the costume war began. One moment in the book stands out vividly. There's this heated back and forth between the production staff and network representatives, the latter warning that the skirts were too short, too modern, too provocative. The production team pushed back, arguing that if humanity had evolved past sexism, then clothing could reflect confidence instead of shame. That argument didn't end the battle, but it shifted it. The network couldn't quite say no, but they couldn't say yes without conditions either. So Star Trek ended up in that liminal space where every costume was a negotiation, not just between art and practicality, but between idealism and 1960s broadcast rules. Then there was the issue of fabric. The production didn't have the budget to test materials the way big studios could. They ordered bolts of colorful velour, thinking it would photograph beautifully under stage lights. It did, for about a week. Then the fabric began to stretch, shrink, warp, sweat through. The collar lines started sagging. Sleeves lost their shape. And one of the running jokes preserved in the book is how the uniforms would fit completely differently from one day to the next. You can almost hear the exasperation as someone jokes,
"Yesterday, he was a captain. Today, he looks like he borrowed the shirt from a cadet."
But nothing, absolutely nothing, was as chaotic as the hair. And here, the book becomes downright comedic, because wigs were everywhere. Kirk's, Uhura's, Rand's towering beehive, guest stars who arrived with hair that didn't match continuity, stunt doubles whose hair couldn't be made to look remotely like the actors they were doubling, and worst of all, hair pieces that disappeared. Not metaphorically. Literally gone. There's an unforgettable anecdote where the crew lost a wig entirely, a crucial piece needed for continuity. The book records the panic. People tearing through dressing rooms, assistants checking trash bins, someone running across the lot yelling,
"Check the bathroom! Check the bathroom!"
They found it eventually, but not intact. The glue was wrong. The fibers were burned by the lights. The piece was ruined. They had to scramble for a replacement while the director stalled for time. And that was just a Tuesday. Grace Lee Whitney faced her own unique hair saga. Her enormous wig wasn't just a style choice. It was a practical way to give Yeoman Rand a distinctive silhouette. But the book reveals how heavy it was, how hot, how painful. She'd returned from takes with indents on her scalp, sweat dripping down her neck, wardrobe rushing in with tissues and cooler fans between setups. Theiss, for his part, never stopped trying to innovate. He had this philosophy, something the book captures brilliantly, that in the future, clothing should be simple, elegant, and cut to flatter movement. That's how we got those iconic lines. The way shirts hugged the torso or draped just right across the shoulder. And it's also how we got the Theiss titillation theory, the idea that a costume should stay on the body not through button or zipper, but through structural integrity, meaning it only stayed in place because gravity refused to let it fall. A brilliant theory, an absolute nightmare for the crew, because every time an actress sat, turned, or breathed too deeply, the future nearly fell off. Wardrobe had to monitor every angle on set. Camera operators would shout if a neckline slipped. Directors had to reset shots when something revealed more than standards and practices would allow. And Theiss, bless him, never relented, because he believed the future was beautiful, confident, and bold. The censors disagreed. The producers negotiated, and the actresses endured. Then there were the male uniforms, which had their own tragedies. The velour not only stretched, but trapped heat miserably. Shatner's uniform famously shrank so much after repeated cleanings that it had to be redesigned. In the book, you can feel the mounting frustration, actors sweating under the lamps while their shirts slowly crept up toward their midriffs. And let's talk about Shatner's hairpiece, because the book doesn't shy away from it. Maintaining the captain's iconic look was a full-time job. The wig had to be styled every day. It had to be secured before each shot. Crew members monitored its shape as closely as they monitored props. On long shooting days, the adhesive would loosen, causing the piece to shift. They'd stop filming, rush him to a chair, and glue everything back down. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes it took hours. It wasn't vanity. It was continuity, The camera sees everything, and the wig had to be perfect. Uhura's wig was a different battle entirely. Nichelle Nichols needed something that could withstand heat, dance numbers, quick turns in the chair, and the glare of lights overhead. Her early wigs wilted, frizzed, lost structure. Each time she walked onto the bridge, the hair team tightened, pinned, tucked, and prayed. And then there's the single most heartbreaking hair story in the book, Leonard Nimoy's tortured relationship with the Spock ears. Technically not wardrobe, but spiritually? Absolutely. The ears were prosthetics designed to create a clean, simple alien silhouette. But the glue burned. The removal hurt. Sweat threatened to peel them off mid-scene. And the worst part? Early versions didn't fit right, so hair had to be styled in ways that disguised the edges. Some days the hair team succeeded, other days they didn't. Nimoy endured it quietly, professionally, but those around him noticed the toll. These small battles built up over time. The costume department started arriving earlier and leaving later than almost anyone else. They developed checklists, emergency kits, backup uniforms, boxes of spare insignias, extra boots, duplicate wigs, fresh collars, new tunic patterns designed to resist the shrinking plague of velour. But the most important thing the book captures is something you can't measure in fabric or pins: pride. For all the frustration, they believed in what they were creating. They believed these outfits mattered. They believed the look of the show reflected the soul of the show: clean, progressive, bold, and hopeful. Star Trek didn't just imagine a better future, it tried to dress like one. And that's why the costume war still feels meaningful. These weren't arguments about hemlines or hairpieces, they were arguments about identity, about how evolved humans would carry themselves, about how women could dress in a world that had outgrown judgment, about how a captain should look stepping into the unknown. That tension, that fire, that pursuit of something better, it's woven into every thread on that bridge. Those mini dresses weren't just fabric. Those wigs weren't just sculpted hair. Those uniforms weren't just color-coded tunics. They were visions, ideals. Hi, I'm Jim from Trek World. The show was collapsing. The budget was dying. And then someone had a wild idea. What if Star Trek solved its problems with impossible technology?
The following program is brought to you in living color by Trek World.
The following video is the most current in a series of videos that will give you a truly unique viewpoint of the behind-the-scenes happenings during production of Star Trek: The Original Series. The video is based entirely and exclusively on the book Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Solow and Bob Justman. You will find an affiliated link in the description that will take you to Amazon to check on availability of a good deal. I highly recommend that you buy a copy of this book and read it. Between this book and The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and Gene Roddenberry, you have the only insiders present at those earliest days to carry these stories forward. Or, as they say, straight from the horse's mouth. Every time I revisit the behind-the-scenes moments recorded in the book, I'm struck by something that feels almost poetic. Star Trek didn't succeed because everything went right. It succeeded because the production team solved impossible problems with even more impossible ideas. And nowhere is that clearer than in the inventions that quietly saved the entire franchise: the transporter and the totally fabricated idea of artificial gravity. What's fascinating is that these weren't decisions made on the fly, halfway through production. They weren't afterthoughts or late-season shortcuts. The urgency came immediately, long before NBC ordered the series, and long before Star Trek existed as a weekly show, because the very first pilot, The Cage, 1964, already needed a way to move characters between ship and planet. And there was no way in the world Desilu could afford to show a shuttle landing every time. So the transporter, that iconic symbol of Star Trek, began as a blunt, urgent solution to a budgetary crisis before the show even existed. It was literally invented to make the pilot filmable. From the moment Desilu looked at the cost breakdown for depicting spacecraft landings, alarm bells went off. Miniatures, motion control rigs, new sets for every planet, optical effects, the numbers ballooned instantly, and the Cage's story demanded multiple surface excursions. The pilot simply wasn't shootable without bleeding money that Desilu didn't have. The team huddled. They argued. They scribbled ideas on napkins, notepads, and the edges of production memos. And out of that creative storm came a proposal that must have sounded ridiculous at first.
What if they just appear somewhere?
Short. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Bill. Hey. Freeze. Short. 1, 2, 3, 4.
No vehicle, no ramp, no landing pad, and no costly miniature photography. Just arrive. It was a desperate idea, a miracle idea, and it became Star Trek's identity. The earliest beaming effect in the Cage was crude but clever. Since no television show had ever needed something like this, the effects artists invented it from scratch using whatever was lying around. Aluminum or metallic dust dropped in front of spotlights, optical dissolves layered in the editing bay, and shimmering tones created by audio engineers experimenting with oscillators. It wasn't clean, it wasn't stable, but it was cheap. And it looked unlike anything on television. The transporter didn't just save the pilot, it became the reason the series could move forward. NBC executives saw a concept that could be executed repeatedly without massive cost overruns. Writer D.C. Fontana would later credit the transporter with allowing scripts to move fluidly from scene to scene without getting bogged down in long travel sequences. The transporter didn't add magic, it added survival. But if the transporter was the loud, shimmering breakthrough, artificial gravity was the quiet miracle working behind every scene. From the moment the Enterprise was conceived, everyone understood the problem. Space is weightless. A realistic depiction of life aboard a starship would involve floating bodies, drifting props, wire harnesses, and complex composite shots. And none of that was even remotely possible for Desilu's budget. Wire rigs were expensive, zero-gravity simulation was impossible, camera tricks were extremely limited. So Gene Roddenberry made a decision that was less scientific theory than production triage.
The ship has artificial gravity.
Just like that. No explanation needed, no diagrams necessary, no weekly effects shots required. Artificial gravity wasn't a world-building flourish. It was the only way the show could function at all. Actors walking normally meant directors could stage scenes like any other television drama. Sets didn't have to be redesigned. Props didn't need to float. And instead of spending half their week figuring out how to mimic weightlessness, the crew could direct their energy toward costumes, makeup, set building, and effects they could afford. Bob Justman later admitted that artificial gravity wasn't a clever scientific prediction. It was a necessity that allowed everyone to stop worrying about floating actors and get back to filming the story. It might be the least glamorous idea in the franchise, but it saved countless hours of planning and prevented weekly budgets from exploding into dust. And that's the heart of what your book captures so beautifully. The transporter and artificial gravity weren't just concepts. They were lifelines the show clung to so it could keep breathing. Once these two foundational ideas were in place, the entire creative process changed. Writers no longer needed to justify how characters moved from ship to planet. They simply wrote, they beam down. Directors no longer had to block scenes around wires. Actors could perform naturally. Scripts flowed more freely. The show gained rhythm, speed, and confidence. What began as shortcuts evolved into mythology. By the time the series aired, audiences embraced the transporter as something wondrous, not the emergency fix it really was. Kids imitated the sparkle effect. Viewers accepted that the Enterprise had gravity without question. And suddenly magic tricks born from budget panic became hallmarks of a universe that felt vast, imaginative, and deeply alive. That's the irony that still moves me. The thing Star Trek is most celebrated for: transporters, gravity plating, fast transitions between worlds, were originally answers to the same question.
How do we film this without going bankrupt?
The show didn't just imagine the future, it invented ways to afford that future. Even in the cage, you can sense the relief behind the transporter scenes. The effect solved a production crisis so elegantly that the team clung to it, refined it, and made it part of the show's DNA. Without that early breakthrough, NBC might never have ordered the series at all. And without artificial gravity, the show would have collapsed under the absurd logistical demands of shooting weightlessness for 79 episodes. When you look at the shimmering transporter beam today, it's easy to see it as purely iconic. But when I look at it, I see the exhaustion behind it, the production artists pouring glitter into lights, editors layering dissolves, Roddenberry praying the effect would actually translate on screen. I see the moment someone first whispered,
"That'll work. We can film the show now."
Innovation through desperation. Ingenuity born from constraint. That's Star Trek. If the transporter was the show's heartbeat, artificial gravity was the steady breath that kept everything functioning. And together, they didn't just solve production problems. They created a storytelling language that carried the franchise for decades. When the characters beam down today, or stride across a starship corridor without floating, we rarely think about how close Star Trek came to financial collapse in those early months. But the transporter and artificial gravity were more than fictional technologies. They were the show's salvation. Two inventions that turned a struggling pilot into a functioning universe, and a functioning universe into a phenomenon that has lasted nearly 60 years.